A house can keep secrets for only so long, and sometimes the darkest ones grow quietly behind closed doors, hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of childhood, grief, and silence. Tonight, you're stepping into The Cement Garden, the haunting debut novel by Ian McEwan, a story that emerged from his fascination with what happens when society's rules disappear and young lives are left to create their own unsettling order. First published in 1978, the novel shocked readers, traveled across the world, and helped establish McEwan as one of the most daring voices in modern literature. Long before works like Atonement and Enduring Love brought him international acclaim, this disturbing psychological tale earned him the nickname Ian McEwan and announced a remarkable literary career. Its unsettling power later reached the screen in the 1993 film adaptation directed by Andrew Birkin, starring Charlotte Gainsbourg. As you listen, remember, this is a third-person retelling inspired by the original novel, not a word-for-word reading, and the visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. Stay with the story, and along the way, you'll discover fascinating facts about the novel, its controversial reception, the film adaptation, and the creative choices that brought this unsettling world to life. Now the doors are closing behind you, and the silence is beginning to settle. The story begins. The boy didn't believe he'd killed his father, but sometimes, in the quiet corners of his own memory, he felt he'd helped the old man on his way. Beside that guilt, the death itself seemed almost insignificant, overshadowed by everything that followed, and coincidentally, timed to a landmark in his own growing body. He and his sisters talked about the father in the week after. Sue definitely cried when the ambulance men wrapped him in that bright red blanket and carried him off. The boy remembered a frail, irritable, obsessive man with yellowish hands and face. He only included this small story of the death to explain one thing: how he and his sisters came to possess so much cement. Early summer, his 14th year, a lorry pulled up outside. He was sitting on the front step, rereading a comic. The driver and another man approached, both coated in fine, pale dust that gave their faces a ghostly sheen. Both whistled, shrill, completely different tunes. He stood, hiding the comic behind him, and suddenly wished he'd been caught reading his father's racing page, or the football results instead. One of the men said a single word: "Cement?" The boy hooked his thumbs in his pockets, shifted his weight, narrowed his eyes. He wanted something terse and appropriate to say, but wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. He waited too long. The man who'd spoken rolled his eyes skyward, hands on his hips, staring past the boy at the front door. The door opened. His father stepped out, biting a pipe, clipboard pressed against his hip. The man repeated the word, this time a statement. The father nodded. The boy folded the comic into his back pocket and followed all three up the path to the lorry. His father stood on tiptoe to look over the side, removed his pipe, nodded again. The other man made a savage chopping motion. A steel pen flew free. One side of the lorry fell away with a tremendous noise. Inside, paper sacks of cement sat packed too deep along the floor. The father counted, glanced at his clipboard, announced the number. 15. Both men grunted. The boy liked that kind of talk. He said the number to himself. The men each took a sack on their shoulders, and the group walked back down the path. The boy in front, then his father. Around the side of the house, the father pointed with the wet stem of his pipe at the coal hole. The men heaved their sacks into the cellar and returned for more. The father made a mark on the clipboard with a pencil dangling from a string. He rocked back on his heels to wait. The boy leaned against the fence. He didn't know what the cement was for, but he didn't want to be left outside this intense community of work by admitting ignorance. He counted the sacks too. When they finished, he stood at his father's elbow as the man signed the delivery note. Then, without a word, the father went back inside. That night, the parents argued over the cement bags, The mother, usually quiet, was furious. She wanted the whole lot sent back. After supper, while she talked, the father scrapped black shards from his pipe bowl onto the food he'd barely touched. He knew how to use that pipe against her. She listed their lack of money, how Tom would soon need new clothes for starting school. He replaced the pipe between his teeth like a missing body part and interrupted. Sending the bags back was out of the question, and that was the end of it. The boy, having seen the lorry and the heavy sacks and the men who'd brought them, sensed his father was right. But how self-important and foolish the man looked, taking the pipe out, holding it by the bowl, pointing the black stem at the mother. She grew angrier, her voice choked with frustration. Julie, Sue, and the boy slipped away upstairs to Julie's bedroom and shut the door. The rise and fall of the mother's voice reached them through the floor, but the words dissolved. Sue lay on the bed, giggling with her knuckles in her mouth, while Julie pushed a chair against the door. Rapidly, they stripped Sue of her clothes. Pulling down her pants, their hands touched. Sue was thin. Her skin clung to her rib cage. The hard, muscular ridge of her buttocks strangely resembled her shoulder blades. Faint gingerish down grew between her legs. The game. Julie and the boy were scientists, examining a specimen from outer space. They spoke in clipped Germanic voices across the naked body. Below, the mother's tired, insistent drone continued. Julie had a high ridge of cheekbone beneath her eyes that gave her the deep look of a rare wild animal. In the electric light, her eyes were black and big. The soft line of her mouth was broken by 2 front teeth. She had to pout a little to hide her smile. The boy longed to examine his older sister, but the game didn't allow it. They asked each other what they thought. They rolled Sue onto her side, then her belly. They stroked her back and thighs with their fingernails. They looked into her mouth and between her legs with a flashlight, finding the little flower made of flesh. One asked the other's opinion. Julie stroked the flower with a moistened finger. A small tremor ran along Sue's bony spine. The boy watched closely. He moistened his finger and slid it over Julie's. She declared it nothing serious, then closed the slit with her finger and thumb, adding, they'd watch for further developments. Sue begged them to continue. The boy and Julie looked at each other knowingly, knowing nothing. He said it was Julie's turn. She refused, as always, saying it was his. Sue, still on her back, pleaded. The boy crossed the room, picked up Sue's skirt, and threw it at her. He declared it out of the question. That was the end of it, speaking through an imaginary pipe. He locked himself in the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bath with his pants around his ankles. He thought of Julie's pale brown fingers between Sue's legs as he brought himself to a quick, dry stab of pleasure. He remained doubled up after the spasm passed. Downstairs, he became aware the voices had long ago stopped. The next morning, he went down into the cellar with his younger brother Tom. The cellar was large, divided into meaningless rooms. Tom clung to his side as they descended the stone stairs. He'd heard about the cement bags and wanted to see them. The coal hole opened into the largest room. The bags lay strewn as they'd fallen over last year's remaining coal. Along one wall stood a massive tin chest, left over from the father's brief army time, once used to keep coke separate from coal. Tom wanted to look inside, so the boy lifted the lid. Empty and blackened, so black that in the dusty light they couldn't see the bottom. Believing he stared into a deep hole, Tom gripped the edge, shouted into the trunk, and waited for an echo. Nothing happened. He demanded to see the other rooms. The boy took him to one nearer the stairs. The door was nearly off its hinges. When he pushed, it came away completely. Tom laughed and finally got his echo from the room they'd just left. Inside, cardboard boxes held mildewed clothes, none familiar. Tom found some of his old toys, turned them over contemptuously with his foot, and declared them for babies. Heaped behind the door stood an old brass cot. They'd all slept in at different times. Tom wanted it reassembled. The boy told him cots were for babies too. At the foot of the stairs, they met their father coming down. He wanted the boy to help him with the sacks. They followed him into the large room. Tom was scared of the father and kept well behind the boy. Julie had recently said something strange. Now that father was a semi-invalid, he'd have to compete with Tom for Mother's attention. The boy had thought about that idea for a long time. So simple, so bizarre. A small boy and a grown man competing. Later, he'd asked Julie who would win. Without hesitation, she'd said Tom, of course, and Dad would take it out on him. And the father was strict with Tom, always needling him, using the mother against Tom just as he used his pipe against her, criticizing how Tom spoke to her or telling him to sit up straight when she talked. She took it all in silence. If the father left the room, she'd briefly smile at Tom or tidy his hair with her fingers. Now Tom stood back from the doorway, watching them drag each sack across the floor, arranging 2 neat lines along the wall. Because of his heart attack, the father wasn't supposed to do this work. The boy made sure the man took as much weight as he did anyway. When they bent down, each grabbing a corner of a sack, the boy felt the father delay, waiting for him to take up the strain. So the boy counted down and pulled only when he saw the man's arms stiffen. If he did more, he wanted the father to acknowledge it aloud. When they finished, they stood back like workers do, admiring the job. The father leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The boy breathed as lightly as he could, through his nose, even though it made him faint. He kept his hands casually on his hips. He asked, now that he had a right to know, what all this was for. The father snatched words between breaths. The garden. The boy waited for more, but after a pause, the father turned to leave. In the doorway, he caught Tom's arm and complained about the state of his hands, unaware of the mess his own hand was making on Tom's shirt. He told Tom to go up. The boy stayed behind a moment, then began turning off the lights. Hearing the clicks, the father stopped at the foot of the stairs and sternly reminded him to turn off all the lights before coming up. The boy said irritably he already was, but the father was coughing loudly on his way up. The father had constructed his garden rather than cultivated it. Following plans he sometimes spread on the kitchen table in the evenings while the children peered over his shoulder. Narrow flagstone paths made elaborate curves to visit flower beds only a few feet apart. One path spiraled up around a rockery like a mountain pass. It had annoyed him once to see Tom walk straight up the side of the rockery, using the path like a short flight of stairs. He shouted from the kitchen window, demanding the boy walk up it properly. The garden itself was a peculiar construction. A lawn the size of a card table raised a couple of feet on a pile of rocks, with just enough space around its edge for a single row of marigolds. Only the father called it the hanging garden. At its center stood a plaster statue of a dancing Pan. Sudden flights of steps went down, then up. A pond with a blue plastic bottom had once held 2 goldfish from a plastic bag. The birds ate them the same day. The paths were so narrow a person could lose balance and fall into the flower beds. The father chose flowers for neatness and symmetry, preferring tulips planted well apart. He hated bushes, ivy, roses, anything that tangled. On either side, the neighboring houses had been cleared. In summer, the vacant sites grew lush with weeds and their flowers. Before his first heart attack, the father had intended to build a high wall around his special world. The family ran a few jokes, initiated and maintained by the father, against Sue for her nearly invisible eyebrows and lashes, against Julie for her ambitions to be a famous athlete, against Tom for wetting his bed, against the mother for being poor at arithmetic, against the boy for his pimples, just starting up at that time. One supper time, the boy passed his father a plate of food, and the father remarked he didn't want his food getting too close to the boy's face. The laughter came instant and ritual. Because little jokes like that were stage managed by the father, none of them ever worked against him. That night, the boy and Julie locked themselves in her bedroom and filled pages with crude, overworked jokes. Everything they thought of seemed hilarious. They fell from the bed to the floor, clutching their chests, screeching. Outside, Tom and Sue banged on the door demanding to be let in. Their best jokes were question and answer ones. Several referenced the father's constipation, but they knew the real target. They selected their best, polished it, practiced it, then waited a day or two. At supper, the father came out with another crack about the boy's spots. They waited for Tom and Sue to stop laughing. The boy's heart beat so hard, it was difficult to sound casual, conversational, the way they'd rehearsed. He said he'd seen something out in the garden today that gave him a shock. Julie asked what that was. He answered, "A flower." No one seemed to hear. Tom talked to himself. The mother poured a little milk into her cup. The father continued buttering a slice of bread with extreme care, folding stray butter back with a quick sliding knife movement. The boy thought maybe they should say it again louder and looked at Julie. She wouldn't meet his eye. The father finished his bread and left the room. The mother said that was quite unnecessary. The boy asked what was, but she said nothing more. Jokes weren't made against the father because they weren't funny. He sulked. The boy felt guilt when he desperately wanted elation. He tried to convince Julie of their victory so she could convince him. That night they had Sue lying between them, but the game gave no pleasure. Sue got bored and left. Julie wanted to apologize, make it up to him somehow. The boy couldn't face that. But 2 days later, when the father spoke to him for the first time since, he felt greatly relieved. The garden wasn't mentioned for a long time. When the father covered the kitchen table with his plans, he looked at them alone. After his first heart attack, he stopped work on the garden altogether. Weeds pushed through cracks in the paving stones. Part of the rockery collapsed. The little pond dried up. The dancing pan fell on its side and broke in two. Nothing was said. The possibility that he and Julie were responsible for the disintegration filled the boy with horror and delight. Shortly after the cement came the sand, a pale yellow pile filling one corner of the front garden. It became apparent, probably through the mother, that the plan was to surround the house, front and back, with an even plane of concrete. The father confirmed this one evening. He said it would be tidier. He wouldn't be able to keep up the garden now, tapping his left breast with his pipe, and it would keep the muck off the mother's clean floors. He was so convinced of his ideas that, through embarrassment rather than fear, no one spoke against the plan. In fact, a great expanse of concrete around the house appealed to the boy. A place to play football, helicopters landing there. Above all, mixing concrete and spreading it over a leveled garden felt like a fascinating violation. His excitement grew when the father talked of hiring a cement mixer. The mother must have talked him out of it, because they started work one Saturday morning in June with 2 shovels. In the cellar, they split open one paper sack and filled a zinc bucket with fine pale gray powder. Then the father went outside to take the bucket as the boy passed it up through the coal hole. When the father reached forward, he made a silhouette against the white featureless sky. He emptied the powder on the path and returned the bucket for refilling. When they had enough, the boy wheeled a barrel load of sand from the front and added it to the pile. The father's plan? A hard path around the side of the house to move sand from front garden to back, easily. Apart from infrequent terse instructions, they said nothing. The boy felt pleased they knew so exactly what they were doing and what the other was thinking that they didn't need to speak. For once, he felt at ease with the father. While the boy fetched water in the bucket, the father shaped the cement and sand into a mound with a dip in its center. The boy mixed while the father added water. The father showed him how to use the inside of his knee against his forearm for better leverage. The boy pretended he already knew. When the mix was consistent, they spread it. Then the father went down on his knees and smoothed the surface with the flat side of a short plank. The boy stood behind him, leaning on his shovel. The father stood, supported himself against the fence, and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he blinked as if surprised to find himself there, then said they should get on. They repeated the operation. Bucket loads through the coal hole, wheelbarrow, water, mixing, spreading, smoothing. The 4th time, boredom and familiar longings slowed the boy's movements. He yawned frequently. His legs felt weak behind the knees. In the cellar, he put his hands in his pants. He wondered where his sisters were. Why weren't they helping? He passed the bucketful to the father, then addressed his shape and said he needed the toilet. The father sighed and made a noise with his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Upstairs, aware of the father's impatience, the boy worked on himself rapidly. As usual, the image before him was Julie's hand between Sue's legs. From downstairs, he could hear the scrape of the shovel. The father was mixing the cement himself. Then it happened, appearing quite suddenly on the back of the boy's wrist. Though he knew about it from jokes and school biology books and had been waiting for many months, hoping he was no different from anyone else, Now he was astonished and moved. Against downy hairs, lying across the edge of a gray concrete stain, glistened a little patch of liquid, not milky as he thought, but colorless. He dabbed it with his tongue. It tasted of nothing. He stared at it a long time, up close, looking for little things with long flickering tails. As he watched, it dried to a barely visible shiny crust that cracked when he flexed his wrist. He decided not to wash it away. He remembered the father waiting and hurried downstairs. The mother, Julie, and Sue stood talking in the kitchen as he passed through. They didn't seem to notice him. The father lay face down on the ground, his head resting on the newly spread concrete. The smoothing plank was still in his hand. The boy approached slowly, knowing he had to run for help. For several seconds he couldn't move away. He stared wonderingly, just as he had a few minutes before. A light breeze stirred a loose corner of the father's shirt. Then came a great deal of activity and noise. An ambulance arrived. The mother went off in it with the father, who was laid out on a stretcher and covered with a red blanket. In the living room, Sue cried, and Julie comforted her. The radio played in the kitchen. After the ambulance left, the boy went back outside to look at their path. He didn't have a thought in his head as he picked up the plank and carefully smoothed away the father's impression from the soft, fresh concrete. During the following year, Julie trained for the school athletics team. She already held the local under-18 records for the 100 and 220-yard sprint. She could run faster than anyone the boy knew. The father had never taken her seriously, said it was daft in a girl running fast, and not long before he died, he'd refused to come to a sports meeting with them. They attacked him bitterly. Even the mother joined in. He laughed at their exasperation. Perhaps he really intended to be there, but they left him alone and sulked among themselves. On the day, because they didn't ask him to come, he forgot and never saw, in the last month of his life, his oldest daughter star of all the field. He missed the pale brown slim legs flickering across the green like blades. He missed the boy, Tom, the mother, and Sue running across the enclosure to cover Julie with kisses when she took her third race. In the evenings, Julie often stayed home to wash her hair and iron the pleats in her navy blue school skirt. She was one of a handful of daring girls at school who wore starched white petticoats beneath their skirts to fill them out and make them swirl when they turned on their heel. She wore stockings and black knickers, strictly forbidden. She had a clean white blouse 5 days a week. Some mornings she gathered her hair at the nape of her neck with a brilliant white ribbon. All this took considerable preparation each evening. The boy used to sit around, watching her at the ironing board, getting on her nerves. She had boyfriends at school, but she never really let them get near her. An unspoken family rule: none of them ever brought friends home. Her closest friends were girls, the most rebellious, the ones with reputations. Sometimes the boy saw her at school at the far end of a corridor, surrounded by a small, noisy group. But Julie herself gave little away. She dominated her group and heightened her reputation with a disruptive, intimidating quietness. The boy had some status at school as Julie's brother, but she never spoke to him there or acknowledged his presence. At some point during the same period, his spots were so thoroughly established across his face that he abandoned all rituals of personal hygiene. He no longer washed his face or hair, cut his nails, or took baths. He gave up brushing his teeth. In her quiet way, the mother reproved him continuously, but he now felt proudly beyond her control. If people really liked him, he argued, they would take him as he was. In the early morning, the mother came into his bedroom and exchanged his dirty clothes for clean ones. On weekends, he lay in bed till afternoon and then took long, solitary walks. In the evenings, he watched Julie, listened to the radio, or just sat. He had no close friends at school. He frequently stared at himself in mirrors, sometimes for as long as an hour. One morning, shortly before his 15th birthday, he was searching in the gloom of the huge hallway for his shoes when he glimpsed himself in a full-length mirror leaning against the wall. The father had always intended to secure it. Colored light through the stained glass above the front door illuminated stray fibers of his hair from behind. The yellowish semi-darkness obscured the humps and pits of his complexion. He felt noble and unique. He stared at his own image till it began to dissociate itself and paralyze him with its look. It receded and returned with each beat of his pulse. A dark halo throbbed above its head and shoulders. The image spoke to him, a single word repeated, then louder. Profanities, each one distinct. From the kitchen, his mother called his name in weary admonition. From the fruit bowl, the boy picked an apple and headed to the kitchen. He slouched in the doorway, watching the family at breakfast while tossing the fruit and catching it with crisp smacks against his palm. Julie and Sue read school books as they ate. Their mother, drained by another sleepless night, wasn't eating, her sunken eyes gray and watery. Tom whined with irritation, trying to push his chair closer to her. He wanted to sit in her lap, but she complained he was too heavy. She arranged his chair and ran her fingers through her hair. The issue, whether Julie would walk to school with him. They used to go together every morning, but now she preferred not to be seen with him. He kept tossing the apple, imagining it made them all uneasy. Their mother watched him steadily. He finally asked Julie to come on. She refilled her teacup and said firmly she had things to do. He should go on. He asked Sue instead. His younger sister didn't look up from her book, murmuring she wasn't going yet. Their mother gently reminded him he hadn't had breakfast, but he was already moving through the hall. He slammed the front door hard and crossed the road. Their house once stood in a street full of houses. Now it stood on empty land, where stinging nettles grew around torn corrugated tin. The other houses had been knocked down for a motorway, never built. Kids from the tower block sometimes came to play nearby, but usually they went farther up to the empty prefabs to kick walls down and scavenge. Once, they set one on fire. No one cared very much. The house was old and large, built to look a little like a castle. Thick walls, squat windows, crenellations above the front door. Seen from across the road, it looked like the face of someone concentrating, trying to remember. No one ever visited. Neither parent had real friends outside the family. Both were only children. All grandparents were dead. The mother had distant relatives in Ireland she hadn't seen since childhood. Tom had a couple of friends he sometimes played with in the street, but they never let him bring them inside. There wasn't even a milkman on their road now. As far as the boy could remember, the last people to visit had been the ambulance men who took his father away. He stood there several minutes, wondering whether to go back inside and say something conciliatory to his mother. Just as he was about to move on, the front door opened and Julie slipped out. She wore her black gabardine school raincoat belted tight at the waist. Collar turned up. She turned quickly to catch the door before it slammed, the coat, skirt, and petticoat spinning with her, the desired effect. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched her sling her satchel over her shoulder. Julie could run like the wind, but she walked as though asleep. Dead slow, straight-backed, in a very straight line. She often appeared deep in thought, but when asked, she always protested her mind was empty. She didn't see him until she was across the road. Then she half smiled, half pouted, and remained silent. Her silence made them all a little afraid of her, but again she would protest, her voice musical with bemusement, that she was the one afraid. It was true she was shy. A rumor said she never spoke in class without blushing. But she had quiet strength and detachment, living in the separate world of those who are, and secretly know they are, exceptionally beautiful. The boy walked alongside her. She stared ahead, back straight as a ruler, lips softly pursed. 100 yards on, their road ran into another street. A few terraced houses remained. The rest, and all houses in the next street across, had been cleared for 4 20-story tower blocks. They stood on wide aprons of cracked asphalt where weeds pushed through. They looked even older and sadder than his house. Colossal, nearly black. Stains from rain ran down their concrete sides. They never dried out. At the end of their road, the boy lunged at Julie's wrist and offered to carry her satchel. She pulled her arm away and kept walking. He danced backward in her path. Her brooding silences turned him into a nuisance. He asked if she wanted to fight or race. She lowered her eyes and stayed her course. In a normal voice, he asked what was wrong. Nothing. Was she pissed off? Yes. With him? Yes. He paused. She was already drifting away. absorbed in some internal vision of her anger. He asked if it was because of their mother. They drew level with the first tower block, seeing through into the lobby. A gang of kids from another school gathered around the lift shaft, lolling against the walls without talking, waiting for someone to come down. The boy said he'd go back then, and stopped. Julie shrugged and made a sudden hand movement, making clear she was leaving him behind. Back on their street, he met Sue. She walked with a book open in front of her, satchel strapped tight and high across her shoulders. Tom walked a few yards behind. From the look on his face, there had been another scene getting him out of the house. The boy felt easier with Sue. She was 2 years younger. If she had secrets, he wasn't intimidated by them. Once he'd seen in her bedroom a lotion she'd bought to dissolve her freckles. Her face was long and delicate, lips colorless, eyes small and tired-looking, with pale, almost invisible lashes. With her high forehead and wispy hair, she sometimes really did look like a girl from another planet. They didn't stop, but as they passed, Sue looked up from her book and said he was going to be late. He muttered he'd forgotten something. Tom was preoccupied with his own dread of school and didn't notice him. The realization that Sue was taking Tom to save their mother the walk increased the boy's guilt, and he walked faster. He went around the side of the house to the back garden and watched his mother through the kitchen window. She sat at the table with the mess of their breakfast and 4 empty chairs before her. Immediately facing her was his untouched bowl of porridge. One hand was in her lap, the other on the table, arm crooked as if ready to receive her head. Near her was a squat black bottle containing her pills. Her face mixed Julie's features with Sue's, as though she were their child. The skin was smooth and taut over fine cheekbones. Each morning she painted on her lips a perfect bow in deepest red. But her eyes, set in dark skin wrinkled like a peach stone, were sunk so far into her skull she seemed to stare out from a deep well. She stroked the thick dark curls at the back of her head. Some mornings he'd find a nest of her hair floating in the toilet. He always flushed it away first. Now she stood and, with her back to him, began clearing the table. When he was 8, he'd come home from school pretending to be seriously ill. His mother indulged him, put him in pajamas, carried him to the living room sofa, wrapped him in a blanket. She knew he'd come home to monopolize her while his father and 2 sisters were out. Perhaps she was glad to have someone home with her during the day. Till late afternoon, he lay there watching her go about her work, and when she was in another part of the house, he listened closely. He was struck by the obvious fact of her independent existence. She went on, even when he was away at school. These were the things she did. Everybody went on. At that time, the insight had been memorable, but not painful. Now, watching her stoop to knock eggshells into the rubbish pail, the same simple recognition conveyed both sadness and menace in unbearable combination. She was not a particular invention of his or of his sister's, though he continued to invent and ignore her. As she moved an empty milk bottle, she turned suddenly toward the window. He stepped back quickly. As he ran down the side path, he heard her open the back door and call his name. He caught a glimpse of her stepping around the corner. She called after him again as he set off down the street. He ran all the way, imagining her voice above the row of his feet on the pavement, calling his name twice. He caught up with Sue just as she was turning through the school gates. He knew it was morning, and he knew it was a bad dream. By an effort of will, he could wake himself. He tried to move his legs, to make one foot touch the other. Any slight sensation would establish him outside the dream. Someone he couldn't see was following him, carrying a box, wanting him to look inside. He hurried on. He paused and tried to move his legs again or open his eyes. But someone was coming with the box. There was no time. He had to run. Then they came face to face. The box, wooden and hinged, might once have held expensive cigars. The lid was lifted half an inch or so, too dark to see inside. He ran on to gain time, and this time succeeded in opening his eyes. Before they closed, he saw his bedroom, his school shirt lying across a chair, a shoe upside down on the floor. Here was the box again. He knew a small creature was inside, kept captive against its will and stinking horribly. He tried to call out, hoping to wake himself with his own voice. No sound left his throat. He couldn't even move his lips. The lid was lifting again. He couldn't turn and run. He'd been running all night, and now he had no choice but to look inside. With great relief, he heard his bedroom door open and footsteps across the floor. Someone sat on the edge of his bed, right by his side, and he could open his eyes. His mother sat in such a way that she trapped his arms inside the bedclothes. It was 8:30 by his alarm. He was going to be late. She would have been up for 2 hours already. She smelled of the bright pink soap she used. She said it was time they had a talk. She crossed one leg over the other, rested her hands on her knees. Her back, like Julie's, was very straight. However ill she was, she always sat very straight. He felt at a disadvantage lying on his back and struggled to sit up, but she told him to lie there a moment. He said he was going to be late. She repeated the instruction with heavy emphasis on the last word. She wanted to talk. His heart beat very fast. He stared past her head at the ceiling, barely out of his dream. She told him to look at her. She wanted to look at his eyes. He looked into hers, and they roved anxiously across his face. He saw his own swollen reflection. She asked if he'd looked at his eyes in a mirror lately. He said no, untruthfully. She noted his pupils were very large. Did he know that? He shook his head, and there were bags under his eyes, even though he'd just woken up. She paused. Downstairs, he could hear the others eating breakfast. She asked if he knew why that was. He shook his head again. She paused again, then leaned forward and spoke urgently. He knew what she was talking about, didn't he? His heart thudded in his ears. He said no. She insisted he did, her tone certain, claiming she could see he did. He had no choice but to confirm this with silence. This sternness didn't suit her at all. There was a flat, play-acting tone in her voice, the only way she could deliver her difficult message. She told him not to think she didn't know what was going on. He was growing into a young man now, and she was very proud. These were things his father would have been telling him. They both looked away, both knowing this wasn't true. Growing up was difficult, she continued, but if he carried on the way he was going to do himself a lot of damage to his growing body. He echoed the word, damage. Yes, she said in a softer voice. Look at himself. He couldn't get up in the mornings. He was tired all day, moody, didn't wash or change his clothes, rude to his sisters and to her, and they both knew why that was. Every time. She trailed off, staring at her hands in her lap rather than at him. Every time he did that, she said, it took 2 pints of blood to replace it. She looked at him defiantly. He whispered the word, blood. She leaned forward and kissed him lightly on the cheek. She asked if he minded her saying this. He said no, not at all. She stood and said that one day, when he was 21, he'd turn around and thank her for telling him what she'd been telling him. He nodded. She stooped, ruffled his hair affectionately, and quickly left the room. His sisters and he no longer played together on Julie's bed. The games had ceased, not long after the father died, though it wasn't his death that ended them. Sue had become reluctant. Perhaps she'd learned something at school and was ashamed of letting them do things to her. The boy was never certain because it wasn't something they could talk about. Julie was more remote now. She wore makeup and had all kinds of secrets. In the dinner queue at school, he once overheard her refer to him as her kid brother. He was stung. She had long conversations with the mother in the kitchen that would break off if Tom, Sue, or the boy came in suddenly. Like the mother, Julie made remarks to him about his hair or his clothes, not gently, but with scorn. Whenever there was disagreement, she would tell him he stank, really stank, and demand to know why he never changed his clothes. Remarks like these made him loutish. He would snarl an insult back at her and go for her ankles, determined to tickle her until she died of exhaustion. She would shriek for their mother, and the mother would call tiredly from wherever she happened to be. The last time he tickled Julie, he waited till the mother was at the doctor's. Then he slipped on a huge, filthy pair of gardening gloves, last worn by the father, and followed Julie up to her bedroom. She sat at the small desk she used for homework. He stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back. She demanded to know what he wanted, full disgust in her voice. They'd been quarreling downstairs. He said simply he'd come to get her, and spread his enormous hands toward her, fingers outstretched. The sight alone advancing on her made her weak. She tried to stand, but fell back in her chair. Through rising giggles, she kept daring him. Just daring him. The big hands were still inches away, and she writhed in her chair, squealing refusals. He declared her time had come. He dragged her by the arm onto her bed. She lay with knees drawn up, hands raised to protect her throat, unable to take her eyes off the great hands he held above her, ready to swoop. She whispered for him to get away from her, addressing the gloves, not him, which struck him as funny. He said they were coming for her, and lowered his hands a few inches, adding that no one knew where they would strike first. She feebly tried to catch his wrists. He slid his hands under hers, clamping the gloves firmly around her rib cage, right into the armpits. As Julie laughed and laughed, fighting for air, he laughed too, delighted with his power. Then there was an edge of panic in her thrashing. She couldn't breathe in. She tried to say please, but in his exhilaration he couldn't stop. Air still left her lungs in little bird-like clucks. One hand plucked at the coarse glove material. As he moved forward to hold her down better, he felt hot liquid spreading over his knee. Horrified, he leaped from the bed and shook the gloves off. Julie's last laughs tailed into tired weeping. She lay on her back, tears spilling over her cheekbones into her hair. The room smelled only faintly of urine. He picked up the gloves. She told him dully to get out. He said he was sorry. She repeated the command. Tom and Sue stood in the doorway watching. Sue asked what happened as he came out. He said nothing and closed the door very quietly. It was about this time that the mother more and more frequently went to bed in the early evening. She said she could barely keep awake. A few early nights in a row, she would say, and she'd be herself again. This left Julie in charge of supper and bedtime. Sue and the boy were in the living room listening to the radio. Julie came in and snapped it off. She told him to empty the rubbish bucket and carry the dustbins around to the front. He shouted an insult, he'd been listening to that, and reached for the control knob. Julie covered it with her hand. He still felt too shamed by his assault on her to struggle. A few words of token resistance, and he was outside carrying the dustbins. When he returned, Sue was at the kitchen sink peeling potatoes. Later at dinner, strained silence replaced the usual row. When he looked across at Sue, she giggled. Julie wouldn't look at him. She spoke in a low voice, only to Tom. When she left the room for a minute to take a tray of food upstairs, Sue and the boy kicked each other under the table and laughed, but stopped when they heard her coming back down. Tom didn't like these evenings without his mother. Julie made him eat everything on his plate and wouldn't permit him to crawl under the table or make funny noises. What outraged him most? Julie wouldn't let him into the mother's bedroom while she was sleeping. He liked to climb in beside her with all his clothes on. Julie caught him by the wrist on his way upstairs, saying quietly that Mum was asleep. Tom set up a terrible howl, but didn't resist when Julie dragged him back to the kitchen. He, too, was a little afraid of her. She was suddenly so remote from them, quiet, certain of her authority. The boy wanted to tell her to stop pretending, that they knew who she really was. He kept looking her way, but there was no answering look. She kept busy, and her eyes met his only briefly. The boy avoided being alone with his mother in case she spoke to him again. He knew from school she had got it wrong, but every time he said to now, once or twice a day, the image of 2-pint milk bottles filled with blood and capped with silver foil passed through his mind. He was spending more time with Sue. She seemed to like him, or at least was prepared to ignore him. She passed much of her time at home reading in her bedroom and never objected to him lying around in there. She read novels about girls her own age having adventures at boarding schools. From the local library, she borrowed large illustrated books about dinosaurs or volcanoes or tropical fish. Sometimes he thumbed through them, looking at the pictures. None of the information interested him. He was suspicious of the dinosaur paintings and told Sue that no one could really know what they looked like. She told him about skeletons and clues for reconstruction. They argued all afternoon. She knew far more than he did, but he was determined not to let her win. Finally, bored and exasperated, they became sulky and left each other alone. But most often they talked like conspirators about the family and everyone else they knew. Careful scrutinies of behavior and appearance, what people were really like. They wondered how ill their mother was. Sue had overheard her tell Julie that she was changing her doctor again. They agreed their older sister was getting above herself. The boy didn't really think of Sue as a girl now. She was, unlike Julie, merely a sister, a person. One long Sunday afternoon, Julie came in during a conversation about their parents. The boy had been saying that secretly the parents had hated each other and that the mother was relieved when the father died. Julie sat on the bed next to Sue, crossed her legs, and yawned. He paused and cleared his throat. Julie said it sounded interesting. Go on. He said it wasn't anything. Julie flushed a little and looked down. Sue cleared her throat, and they all waited. The boy said foolishly he was just saying he didn't think Mom ever really liked Dad. Julie asked with mock interest if that was so. She was angry. He muttered he didn't know. Perhaps Julie knew. She demanded why she should know. Another silence. Sue said it was because Julie talked to the mother more than they did. Julie's anger expressed itself in mounting silence. She stood, crossed the room, and turned in the doorway to say quietly that only because the two of them wouldn't have anything to do with her. She paused by the door, waiting for a reply, then left, leaving behind a very faint smell of perfume. The next day after school, the boy offered to walk down to the shops with his mother. She said there was nothing to carry, standing in the gloomy hallway knotting her scarf in the mirror. He mumbled he felt like a walk. They walked in silence for several minutes. Then she linked her arm through his and mentioned his birthday was soon. He agreed, pretty soon. She asked if he was excited about turning 15. He said he didn't know. While they waited in a chemist's shop for her prescription, he asked what the doctor had said. She examined a gift-wrapped bar of soap in a plastic dish, put it down, and smiled cheerily, saying they were all talking rubbish. She'd done with a lot of them. She nodded toward the pharmaceutical counter, as long as she got her pills. He felt relieved. The prescription came at last in a heavy brown bottle, which he offered to carry. On the way home, she suggested a little party on his birthday, and that he invite a few friends from school. He said no immediately. Let's just have the family. For the rest of the way home, they made plans, both glad to finally have something to talk about. The mother remembered a party on Julie's 10th birthday. The boy remembered it too. He was 8. Julie had wept because someone told her there were no more birthdays after 10. It became a family joke for a while. Neither mentioned the effect the father had on that in all the other parties the boy could remember. The father had liked the children to stand in neat lines waiting their turn at some game he'd set up. Noise and chaos, children milling without purpose, irritated him profoundly. There was never a birthday party during which he didn't lose his temper with someone. At Sue's 8th, he tried to send her to bed for fooling around. The mother intervened, and that was the last of the parties. Tom had never had one. By the time they reached the front gate, they had fallen silent. As she fumbled for her key, the boy wondered if she was glad they would be having this party without him. He said it was a pity Dad couldn't be, and she said, poor dear, he would have been so proud. 2 days before the boy's birthday, the mother took to her bed. She said she'd be up in time. She wasn't ill, just very, very tired. Even as she spoke, her eyes were barely open. She had already made a cake and iced it with concentric circles of red and blue. In the very center stood one candle. Tom was amused by this, shouting that the boy wasn't 15. He was only 1 when it was his birthday. Early in the morning, Tom came into the room and jumped on the bed, shouting, "Wake up! He was 1 today." At breakfast, Julie handed him a small leather pouch containing a metal comb and nail scissors, without comment. Sue gave him a science fiction novel with a cover showing a great tentacled monster engulfing a spaceship against a star-pierced black sky. He took a tray up to the mother's room. She lay on her back, eyes open. He sat on the edge of her bed, balancing the tray on his knees. She sat, propped by pillows, sipping tea, then said, "Happy birthday, son." She couldn't speak in the mornings till she'd had something to drink. They embraced clumsily over the teacup she still held. Inside the card she gave him were 2-pound notes. The card showed a still-life photograph of a globe, old leather-bound books, fishing tackle, and a cricket ball. He embraced her again, and she said, "Oops," as the cup wobbled. They sat together a while. She squeezed his hand. Hers was yellowish and scrawny, like a chicken's foot, he thought. All morning he lay on his bed reading Sue's book, the first novel he'd ever read all the way through. Minute life-bearing spores drifting across galaxies, touched by rays from a dying sun, had hatched into a colossal monster, feeding off X-rays and terrorizing regular space traffic between Earth and Mars. Commander Hunt's task, not only to destroy the beast, but to dispose of its gigantic corpse. A scientist explained that allowing it to drift forever through space would create a collision hazard, and who knew what other cosmic rays might do to rotten bulks, or what monstrous mutation might emerge from the carcass. When Julie came in and told him Mother wasn't getting up and they were having the cake around her bedside, he was so engrossed he stared at her without comprehension. As she left, she suggested he do the mother a favor and clean himself up for once. In the afternoon, Tom and Sue carried the cake and cups upstairs. The boy locked himself in the bathroom and stood before the mirror. He was not the kind Commander Hunt would have had aboard his spaceship. He was trying to grow a beard to conceal his skin, yet each sparse hair led the eye like a pointing finger to the spot at its base. He filled the basin with hot water and leaned with immersed palms, taking his weight against the bottom, often passing half an hour this way, inclined toward the mirror, hands and wrists in hot water. It was the closest he came to washing. He daydreamed instead, this time about Commander Hunt. When the water cooled, he dried his hands, took the leather pouch, cut his fingernails, and combed his lank brown hair, experimenting with styles and deciding to celebrate his birthday with a center parting. As he entered the mother's bedroom, Sue started singing Happy Birthday, the others joining. The cake rested on the bedside table, its candle already lit. The mother lay surrounded by pillows. Though she moved her lips to the song, he couldn't make out her voice. When they finished, he blew out the candle. Tom danced before the bed chanting, "You're one, till Julie shushed him. The mother said he looked very smart and asked if he'd just had a bath. He said yes and cut the cake. Sue poured orange juice she said she'd made from 4 pounds of real oranges. Tom asked if all oranges were real. They all laughed, and Tom, delighted, repeated himself with diminishing success. It was hardly a party, and the boy was impatient to return to his book. Julie had arranged 4 chairs in a shallow curve facing one side of the bed. There they sat, nibbling cake and sipping juice. The mother ate and drank nothing. Julie wanted something to happen, wanted them to be entertaining. She asked Sue to tell the joke she'd told her yesterday. Sue told it. The mother laughed. Then Julie told Tom to show them all his cartwheel. They moved chairs and plates aside so Tom could fool around on the floor and giggle. Julie made him stop after a while, then turned to the boy and asked why he didn't sing them a song. He said he didn't know any. She suggested Greensleeves. The very title irritated him. He said he wished she'd stop telling people what to do. She wasn't God, was she? Sue intervened, telling Julie to do something herself. While they talked, Tom had taken off his shoes and climbed into bed beside the mother. She put her arm around his shoulder and watched them as if from a long way off. The boy agreed. Julie should do something for a change. Without a word, Julie launched herself into the space cleared for Tom's cartwheels. Suddenly, her body was upside down, supported only by her hands, taut, lean, perfectly still. Her skirt fell over her head. Her knickers showed brilliant white against the pale brown skin of her legs. He could see how the material bunched in little pleats around the elastic clinging to her flat, muscular belly. A few black hairs curled out from the white crotch. Her legs, together at first, now moved slowly apart like giant arms. She brought them together again and dropped to the floor, standing up. In a confused, wild moment, the boy found himself on his feet singing Greensleeves in a trembling, passionate tenor. When he finished, they all clapped, and Julie squeezed his hand. The mother smiled drowsily. Everything was cleared quickly. Julie lifted Tom out of the bed. Sue carried away the plates and cake remains, and the boy took the chairs. One hot afternoon, the boy found a sledgehammer lying concealed by weeds and long grass. He was in the garden of one of the abandoned prefabs, poking around, bored. The building had been gutted by fire 6 months before. He stood inside the blackened living room where the ceiling had collapsed and floorboards burned away. One partitioned wall remained, with a serving hatch connecting to the kitchen. One small wooden door still hung on its hinges. In the kitchen, broken water pipe sections and electrical fittings clung to the wall. A smashed sink lay on the floor. Tall weeds struggled for light in all the rooms. Most houses were crammed with immovable objects in their proper places, each object telling you what to do. Here you ate, here you slept, here you sat, but in this burned-out place, there was no order. Everything had gone. He tried to imagine carpets, wardrobes, pictures, chairs, a sewing machine in these gaping, smashed-up rooms. He was pleased by how irrelevant, how puny such objects now appeared. A mattress lay in one room, buckled between blackened, broken joists. The wall crumbled away around the window. The ceiling had fallen in without quite reaching the ground. The people who slept on that mattress, he thought, really believed they were in the bedroom. They took for granted it would always be so. He thought of his own bedroom, Julie's, his mother's, all rooms that would one day collapse. He had climbed over the mattress and was balancing on a ridge of broken wall when he saw the sledgehammer handle in the grass. He jumped down and seized it. Gray wood lice had been living under the massive iron head. Now they ran backward and forward in blind confusion across the little patch of earth. He swung the hammer down on them and felt the ground shake beneath his feet. A good find, probably left by firemen or a demolition team. He balanced it over his shoulder and carried it home, wondering what he could usefully smash. In the garden, the rockery was disintegrating and overgrown. Nothing to lay into, apart from the paving stones, and they were already cracked. He decided on the cement path, 15 feet long, a couple inches thick, serving no purpose. He stripped to the waist and set to. A little concrete crumbled on the first blow, but the next few produced nothing, not even a crack. He rested and began again. This time, surprisingly, a great fissure opened, and a large, satisfying piece of concrete came away, about 2 feet across, heavy to lift. He pulled it clear and rested it against the fence. He was about to pick up the hammer again when he heard Julie's voice behind him. She told him he was not to do that. She wore a bright green bikini, holding a magazine in one hand and her sunglasses in the other. Around this side of the house, they were in deep shade. He rested the hammerhead on the ground between his feet and leaned on the handle, demanding what she was talking about and why not. She said, "Mom said so." He picked up the hammer and swung it at the path as hard as he could. He looked over his shoulder at his sister, who shrugged and walked away. He called after her, asking why. Without turning, Julie said the mother wasn't feeling well. She had a headache. He swore and rested the hammer against the wall. He had accepted without curiosity that the mother was rarely out of bed now. She became bedridden so gradually they hardly commented on it. Since his birthday 2 weeks before, she hadn't been up at all. They adapted well enough, taking turns with the tray, Julie shopping on the way home from school, Sue helping cook, the boy washing dishes. The mother lay surrounded by magazines and library books, but he never saw her reading. Most of the time she dozed sitting up. When he came in, she would wake with a little start and say she must have dropped off for a moment. Because there were no visitors, no one asked what was wrong with her, so the boy never really put the question clearly to himself. Julie, it turned out, knew far more. Every Saturday morning, she took the prescription for renewal and came back with the brown bottle full again. No doctors came to see the mother. She'd said she'd seen enough doctors and had enough tests to last a lifetime. That seemed reasonable to him, tiring of doctors. The mother's bedroom became the center of the house. They would be there, talking among themselves or listening to her radio while she dozed. Sometimes he heard her giving Julie instructions about shopping or Tom's clothes in a soft, rapid undertone. When Mother Gets Up became a vague, unsought-for time in the near future when old patterns would reestablish. Julie appeared serious and efficient, but the boy suspected she was exploiting the position, enjoying ordering him about. She told him one weekend it was about time he cleaned up his room. He asked what she meant. She said it was a mess. It smelled of something in there. He said nothing. She added he better clean it up, Mum said. Because his mother was ill, he thought he should do what she asked. And while he did nothing to his room, he thought about it, worried about cleaning it. The mother never mentioned his room to him, and he began to think she'd never said anything to Julie. After staring at the sledgehammer a minute or two, he walked around to the back garden. Mid-July, only a week before summer holidays, and it had been hot every day for 6 weeks. Difficult to imagine it ever raining again. Julie was anxious to be suntanned and had cleared a little flat patch on top of the crumbling rockery. Each day she spread her bath towel for an hour after school, lying with hands and fingers flattened on the ground beside her, turning onto her belly every 10 minutes or so, hooking loose her bikini straps with her thumbs. She liked to set off her deepening color with a white school blouse. She had just settled again as he came around the corner. Lying on her belly, head cradled on her forearms, face turned away toward the wasteland where great clusters of stinging nettles were dying of thirst. At her side, lodged between her sunglasses and a thick tube of suntan lotion, sat a miniature silver and black transistor radio, from which came the thin, rattling sound of male voices. The sides of the rockery dropped sharply away from where she lay. A slight movement to her left and she would roll down toward his feet. Shrubs and weeds were withered. Her brilliant, luminescent bikini was all that was green on the rockery. He spoke to her over the radio voices. She didn't turn her head, but he knew she'd heard. He asked when Mum had told her to tell him to stop making that noise. Julie didn't move or speak, so he clambered around the rockery to see her face. Her eyes were open. He said she'd been out here all the time, but Julie asked him to do her a favor, rub some lotion on her back. As he climbed, his foot dislodged a large rock that thudded to the ground. She told him to be careful. He knelt between her open legs and squirted pale, creamy fluid onto his palm. She sat up by her shoulders and neck was where it needed most, and dropping her head, she lifted her hair clear of her nape. Though they were only 5 feet above ground, a slight refreshing breeze seemed to move up here. As he rubbed cream into her shoulders, he noticed how pale and grubby his own hands appeared against her back. Her shoulder straps were untied and trailed on the ground. If he moved a little to one side, he could just make out her breast, obscure in the deep shade of her body. When he finished, she called over her shoulder to do her legs now. This time, he rubbed the cream on as quickly as possible, eyes half closed. He felt hot and sick in his stomach. Julie's head rested once more on her forearm. Her breathing was slow and regular, like someone asleep. From the radio, a piping voice recounted racing results with malicious monotony. As soon as her legs were adequately coated, he jumped down off the rockery. She called, thanks sleepily. He hurried indoors and upstairs to the bathroom. Later that evening, he threw the sledgehammer down into the cellar. Every 3 mornings, it was his turn to walk Tom to school. Always difficult to get him to go. Sometimes he screamed and kicked and had to be carried out. One morning, shortly before the end of term, Tom told him quite calmly as they walked that he had an enemy at school. The words sounded eerie. The boy asked what he meant. Tom explained that a bigger boy was out to get him, gonna bash his head in, said with something close to wonderment. The boy wasn't surprised. Tom was just the kind to be picked on, small for 6, frail, pale, a little jug-eared, with an idiotic grin and black hair growing in a thick, lopsided fringe. Worse, he was clever in a niggling, argumentative way, the perfect playground victim. The boy said to tell him who it was, and he'd sort him out. They stopped outside the school and peered through black railings. Tom pointed toward a small wooden shed. A scrawny-looking kid, a couple of years older than Tom, red-headed and freckled. The meanest sort, the boy thought. He crossed the playground at great speed, seized the kid by the lapel with his right hand, gripped his throat with the other, banged him hard against the shed, and pinned him there. The kid's face shook and seemed to bulge. The boy wanted to laugh out loud, so wild was his elation. He hissed that if the kid laid a finger on his brother, he'd rip his legs off. Then he let go. It was Sue who brought Tom home that afternoon. His shirt hung in shreds off his back. One shoe was gone. One side of his face was swollen and red, a corner of his mouth torn. Both knees grazed, dried blood streaking down his shin. His left hand was swollen and tender, as if it had been trodden on. As soon as he got inside, Tom began a strange animal howl and made for the stairs. Julie shouted not to let Mum see him like that. They were on him like a pack of hounds onto a wounded rabbit, carrying him into the downstairs bathroom and shutting the door. With all four of them in there, not much space. In the hollow acoustic, Tom's cries were deafening. Julie, Sue, and the boy pressed around him, kissing and caressing as they undressed him. Sue was almost crying too, repeating over and over, "Our poor little Tom." With all this going on, the boy still managed to feel envy for his naked brother. Julie sat on the bath's edge. Tom stood between her knees, leaning back against her while she dabbed his face with cotton wool. Her free hand steadied him, palm flat against his belly, just above the groin. Sue held a cold flannel against his bruised hand. The boy asked if it was that ginger kid. Tom wailed no, his friend. Once cleaned up, Tom didn't look so badly hurt. The drama ebbed. Julie wrapped him in a bath towel and carried him upstairs. Sue and the boy went ahead to prepare the mother. She must have heard something. She was out of bed in her dressing gown, ready to come down. They told her just a little scrap at school, but he was all right. Now, she got back into bed. Julie put Tom in beside her. Later, as they sat around the bed talking about what happened and drinking tea, Tom, still wrapped in the towel, fell asleep. They were downstairs one evening after supper. Both Tom and the mother were already asleep. The mother had sent Julie to Tom's school that day to talk to the class teacher about the bullying. They'd been talking about that. Sue told Julie and the boy she'd had the weirdest conversation with Tom. Sue waited for one of them to prompt her. The boy asked wearily what Tom said. Sue giggled and said, "Tom told her not to tell anyone." Julie said she'd better not then, but Sue continued. Tom had come into her room and asked what it was like being a girl. She said it was nice. Why? He said he was tired of being a boy and wanted to be a girl now. She said he couldn't be a girl if he was a boy. He insisted he could if he wanted to. She asked why. "Because you don't get hit when you're a girl," he said. She said you do sometimes, but he insisted, "No, you don't." So then she asked how he could be a girl when everyone knew he was a boy. He said he'd wear a dress and make his hair like hers and go in the girls' entrance. She said he couldn't do that. He said yes, he could, and then he said he wanted to anyway. Sue and Julie were laughing so much now that Sue couldn't continue. The boy didn't even smile. He was horrified and fascinated. Julie said, "Poor little thing. They should let him be a girl if he wanted." Sue was delighted, clapping her hands, saying he'd look so beautiful in one of her old frocks with that sweet little face. They looked at each other and laughed. Strange excitement in the air. The boy said suddenly he'd look bloody idiotic. Julie asked coolly why he thought that. He said Tom just would. A pause. Julie was gathering and shaping her anger. Her bare arms lay across the table, a deeper brown than ever under the electric light. The boy didn't even smile. He was horrified and fascinated. Julie said, "Poor little thing. They should let him be a girl if he wanted." Sue clapped her hands, delighted, saying he'd look so beautiful in one of her old frocks with that sweet little face. They looked at each other and laughed. Strange excitement in the air. The boy said suddenly he'd look bloody idiotic. Julie asked coolly why he thought that. He muttered that Tom just would. A pause. Julie was gathering and shaping her anger, her bare arms a deeper brown than ever under the electric light. He muttered further, making Tom look stupid just so they could have a laugh. Julie spoke quietly, asking if he thought girls looked idiotic, daft, stupid. He said no indignantly. She pressed. He thought it was humiliating to look like a girl, because he thought it was humiliating to be a girl. He said it would be for Tom to look like a girl. Julie took a deep breath, her voice dropping to a murmur. She explained that girls could wear jeans and cut their hair short and wear shirts and boots because it was okay to be a boy. For girls, it was like promotion. But for a boy to look like a girl was degrading, according to him, because secretly he believed being a girl was degrading. Why else would he think it was humiliating for Tom to wear a frock? He said determinedly, because it was. But Julie and Sue called together asking why. Before he could think, Julie said if she wore his trousers to school tomorrow and he wore her skirt, they'd soon see who had the worst time. Everyone would point and laugh at him. She pointed across the table, fingers inches from his nose, mimicking the mockery. "Look at him. He looks just like a girl." And Sue pointed at Julie, saying she looked rather clever in those trousers. The two sisters laughed so hard, they collapsed in each other's arms. It was simply a theoretical discussion. For one day later, Tom was back at school, and his teacher wrote the mother a long letter. She read parts aloud while Sue and the boy maneuvered the dining room table into her bedroom. The mother read with great satisfaction a line about Tom being a pleasure to have in class. She also liked that he was a gentle but spirited child. They had decided to eat meals in the bedroom with her. The boy carried up 2 small armchairs too. Now there was barely space to move around the bed. Reading the letter exhausted her. She lay back against the pillows, holding her glasses loosely in one hand. The letter slid to the floor. Sue picked it up and pushed it back into the envelope. The mother told her that when she was up, they'd redecorate the downstairs room before putting all the furniture back. Sue sat on the bed and they talked about color schemes. The boy sat at the table, leaning on his elbows. Late afternoon, still very hot. Both sash windows were open as far as they could go. From outside came sounds of kids playing around the empty prefabs farther up the street, sudden shouts above the murmur of voices, someone's name being called. Many flies in the room. He watched one crawl the length of his arm. Julie was sunning herself on the rockery. Tom was out playing somewhere. The mother had fallen asleep. Sue took the glasses from her hand, folded them, placed them on the bedside table, and left. The boy listened to the rise and fall of his mother's breathing. A particular arrangement of mucus in her nose caused a faint, high-pitched sound like a sharp blade in the air. Then that faded. Having the dining room table up here was still a novelty. He couldn't quite leave it. He saw for the first time the swirling black lines of the wood's grain beneath the dark lacquer stain. He rested his bare arms along its cool surface. It seemed more substantial here. He could no longer imagine it downstairs. From her bed, the mother made a brief, soft chewing sound with her tongue against her teeth, as though dreaming of thirst. Finally, he went to stand by the window, yawning frequently. He had homework to do, but since the long summer holiday was about to begin, he no longer cared. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to return to school in the autumn, yet he had no plans to do anything else. Outside, Tom and another boy about his size pulled a large lorry tire along the street until they were out of sight. The fact that they were dragging it and not rolling it made the boy feel immensely weary. He was about to sit at the table again when his mother called his name, and he went to sit on her bed. She smiled and touched his wrist. He moved his hand between his knees. He didn't want to be touched. It was too hot. She asked what he was up to. "Nothing," he said through a sigh. "Fed up?" He nodded. She tried to stroke him, but he sat just out of reach. She said, "Let's hope he could find a job for the holidays, get himself some pocket money." He grunted ambiguously and briefly turned his face toward her. Her eyes, as always, were sunk deep, the skin around them dark and convoluted, as though it too were a seeing surface. Her hair was thinner and grayer. A few strands lay on the sheet. She wore a grayish-pink cardigan over her nightdress, its sleeve bulging at the wrist from tucked-in handkerchiefs. She asked him to sit a little nearer. There was something she wanted to tell him, and she didn't want the others to hear. He moved up the bed. She rested her hand on his forearm. A minute or two passed. She didn't speak. He waited, a little bored, a little suspicious that she wanted to talk about his appearance or his squandered blood. If that was it, he was ready to walk away. At last, she said she might have to go away soon. He asked where. To the hospital, to give them a chance to get to the bottom of whatever she had. He asked how long. She paused, her eyes moving from his to stare over his shoulder. It might be quite a long time. That's why she wanted to talk. He was more interested in how long she really meant. A sense of freedom tugged at his concern. But she was saying it meant Julie, and he would have to be in charge. He said sullenly, that meant Julie would. She said firmly, both of them. It wasn't fair to leave it all to Julie. He said she'd better tell Julie that he was in charge too. The mother continued, the house must be run properly. Tom had to be looked after. Things kept clean and tidy. Otherwise, she said, they'd come and put Tom into care, and perhaps him and Susan too. Julie wouldn't stay by herself, so the house would stand empty. Word would get around. It wouldn't be long before people broke in, took things, smashed everything up. She squeezed his arm and smiled. Then when she came out of hospital, there would be nothing for them all to come back to. He nodded. She'd opened a post office account for Julie. Money would be paid in from her savings, enough for them all for quite a while, easily until she came out. She settled back against the pillows and half closed her eyes. He stood and said, "Okay. When did she go in?" She said it might not be for a week or two yet. As he reached the door, she said the sooner the better, she thought. He agreed. The different position of his voice made her open her eyes. He stood at the door, ready to leave. She said she was tired of lying there doing nothing all day. 3 days later, she was dead. Julie found her when she got in from school on Friday afternoon. The last day of the summer term, Sue had taken Tom swimming. The boy arrived back minutes after Julie. As he turned down the front path, he saw Julie leaning out of the mother's window. She saw him, but they ignored each other. He didn't go upstairs immediately. He took off his jacket and shoes, drank a glass of cold water from the kitchen tap. He looked in the refrigerator, found some cheese, ate it with an apple. The house was very quiet. He felt oppressed by the empty weeks ahead. He hadn't found a job yet, hadn't even looked. Out of habit, he went upstairs to say hello to his mother. He found Julie on the landing just outside the bedroom. When she saw him, she pulled the door shut and stooped to lock it. Trembling slightly, she stood facing him. The key clenched tightly in her fist. She said evenly that she was dead. He demanded what she meant. How did she know? Julie said she'd been dying for months, pushing past him on the stairs, adding that she didn't want you lot to know. He resented you lot immediately. He said he wanted to give him the key. Julie shook her head. She said he better come down and talk before Tom and Sue got in. For a moment, he thought of snatching the key, but he turned and, lightheaded, close to blasphemous laughter, followed his sister down. He found Julie already waiting in the kitchen, her hair pulled back into a ponytail, arms crossed as she leaned against the sink. One foot bore her weight, the other braced flat against the cupboard behind her, pushing her knee forward. She demanded to know where he had been, but the words didn't land. He said he wanted to see. She shook her head. He circled the table, insisting they were both in charge, that their mother had told him so. Julie cut him off with the news. She was dead. She told him to sit down, asked if he understood yet. He sat. Through tears, he repeated that he was in charge too, crying because he felt cheated. His mother had vanished without proving to Julie what she told him. Not the hospital. Gone completely. No verification possible. For a moment, the fact of her death became clear, and his crying turned dry and hard. Then, he imagined himself as someone whose mother had just died, and the crying became wet and easy again. Julie's hand settled on his shoulder. The moment he noticed it, he saw them both as if through the kitchen window, a frozen tableau of sitter and stander. For a brief stretch, he wasn't sure which one he was. Someone below him wept at the end of his fingers. He couldn't tell if Julie waited tenderly or impatiently, if she was thinking of him at all. Her touch felt neutral. That uncertainty stopped his tears. He wanted to see her face. Julie moved back to the sink and mentioned that Tom and Sue would be arriving. He wiped his face on the kitchen towel, blew his nose. She suggested they might as well tell the others the moment they walked in. He nodded. They stood in silence for nearly half an hour. When Sue came in and Julie broke the news, both girls burst into tears and held each other. Tom was still outside somewhere. He watched his sisters cry. Looking away would have felt hostile. Excluded, but unwilling to show it, he placed a hand on Sue's shoulder the way Julie had done to him. Neither noticed, like wrestlers locked together, so he took it back. Through their crying, Julie and Sue murmured unintelligible things, maybe to themselves, maybe to each other. He wished he could let go like that, but felt watched. He wanted to go check his reflection. Tom entered, demanded a glass of squash, drank it, and left. Sue and he followed Julie upstairs. On the landing, waiting for her to open the door, he pictured Sue and himself as a married couple about to be shown into a sinister hotel room. He belched. Sue giggled. Julie shushed them. Julie later explained the curtains had been left undrawn to avoid suspicion. Sunlight filled the room. Their mother lay propped on pillows, hands beneath the sheet. Her eyes weren't open and staring like dead people's in films, nor completely closed. She looked like someone about to doze off. Magazines and books lay on the floor near the bed. On the bedside table, a ticking alarm clock, a glass of water, an orange. While Sue and he watched from the foot of the bed, Julie tried to pull the sheet over their mother's head. Because the body was sitting up, the sheet wouldn't reach. Julie pulled harder, loosened it, and covered the head. Their mother's bluish-white feet appeared, toes spread apart. Sue and he giggled again. Julie pulled the blanket over the feet, and the head emerged once more like an unveiled statue. All three of them laughed uncontrollably. Julie threw clenched teeth, her whole body shaking. The bedclothes finally settled. Julie came to stand by them at the foot of the bed. The shape of the head and shoulders remained obvious under the white sheet. Sue wailed that she looked ridiculous like that. Julie snapped back that she did not. Sue reached forward and pulled the sheet clear of the head. Almost simultaneously, Julie punched Sue's arm hard and shouted at her to leave it alone. The door opened. Tom stood there, breathless from playing outside. The moment Julie and he caught hold of Tom, he said he wanted their mother. They whispered that she was asleep. Look, you could see. Tom struggled past them, asking why they had been shouting then, insisting she wasn't asleep. Sue said she was very asleep. For a moment, it seemed they might use that idea, a very deep sleep, to introduce Tom to death. But they knew no more about it than he did, and he sensed something was wrong. Tom yelled for their mother and tried to fight his way around the bed. He held Tom by the wrists and said he couldn't go. Tom kicked his ankle, broke free, and slipped past Julie to the head of the bed. Steadying himself with one hand on their mother's shoulder, Tom took off his shoes and glared at them in triumph. Similar scenes had happened before. Sometimes Tom got his way. By now, he was ready to let Tom find out for himself. He just wanted to watch. But the moment Tom pulled back the bedclothes to climb in beside their mother, Julie sprang forward, caught his arm, and gently told him to come on. Tom squealed his usual refusal, his free hand gripping the sleeve of their mother's nightdress. As Julie pulled, the body toppled sideways in a frightening wooden way. The head struck the bedside table. The clock and glass of water crashed to the floor. The head stayed wedged between the bed and the table. One hand now appeared near the pillow. Tom went quiet and still, almost rigid, and let Julie lead him away like a blind man. Sue had already left, though he hadn't noticed her go. He paused, wondering whether to push the corpse upright. He took one step toward her, but couldn't bear the thought of touching her. He ran out, slammed the door, turned the key, and put it in his pocket. Early evening, Tom cried himself to sleep on the downstairs sofa. They covered him with a bath towel. No one wanted to go upstairs alone for a blanket. The rest of the evening they sat in the living room saying little. Once or twice, Sue started crying, then stopped, as if the effort exhausted her. Julie suggested their mother probably died in her sleep. He and Sue nodded. After a couple of minutes, Sue added that it didn't hurt. He and Julie murmured in agreement. A long pause. Then he asked again if anyone was hungry. His sisters shook their heads. He longed to eat, but didn't want to eat alone. Didn't want to do anything alone. When they finally agreed to have something, he brought in bread, butter, marmalade, and 2 pints of milk. As they ate and drank, conversation picked up. Julie said she first knew 2 weeks before his birthday. He recalled that was when she did her handstand. Sue added that Julie also sang Greensleeves, then asked what she herself had done. None of them could remember. Sue kept insisting she knew she'd done something until he told her to shut up. A little after midnight, they went upstairs together, keeping very close on the stairs. Julie went first. He carried Tom. On the first landing, they stopped and huddled before passing their mother's door. He thought he could hear the alarm clock ticking. He was glad the door was locked. They put Tom to bed without waking him. The girls had silently agreed to sleep in the same bed. He got into his own bed, lay on his back tensely, and turned his head violently away whenever an unwanted thought or image arose. After half an hour, he went into Tom's room and carried him into his own bed. He noticed the light was still on in Julie's room. He put his arms around his brother and fell asleep. Toward the end of the next day, as they sat around the rockery in the garden, having spent the whole day outside because of the heat and because the house at their backs now felt not concentrated but heavily asleep, Sue asked if they ought to tell someone. That morning a row had broken out over Julie's bikini. Sue thought it was wrong to wear it. He said he didn't care. Sue said wearing the bikini meant Julie didn't care about their mother. Tom started crying, and Julie went inside to change. He passed the day looking through old comics, some of them Tom's. At the back of his mind, he sensed they were sitting around waiting for some terrible event. Then he would remember it had already happened. Sue looked through her books and sometimes cried to herself. Julie sat atop the rockery, rattling pebbles in her cupped hands, tossing and catching them. She grew irritable with Tom, who whined for attention one moment and played as if nothing had happened the next. Once, Tom tried to climb onto Julie's knee. He heard her push him away and ask him to go away. That afternoon, he read to Tom from one of the comics. When Sue asked her question, Julie glanced up briefly, then looked away. He said, if they told someone, and left the sentence hanging. Sue said they had to tell someone so there could be a funeral. He glanced at Julie, who was staring past the garden fence, across empty land toward the tower blocks. He started again. If they told, authorities would put them into care, an orphanage or something, and might try to get Tom adopted. Sue was horrified, saying they couldn't do that. He continued. The house would stand empty, people would break in, nothing would be left. Sue countered that if they didn't tell anyone, what would they do? He looked again at Julie and said, louder, that those kids would come in and smash everything up. Julie tossed her pebbles across the fence and said they couldn't leave the body in the bedroom or it would start to smell. Sue nearly shouted that was a terrible thing to say. He asked Julie if that meant they shouldn't tell anybody. Julie walked off toward the house without answering. He watched her go into the kitchen and splash her face at the sink, holding her head under the cold tap until her hair was soaked, then wringing it out and sweeping it from her face. Drops of water ran onto her shoulders as she walked back. She sat on the rockery and said, if they didn't tell anybody, they had to do something themselves quickly. Sue was close to tears. Julie tossed her pebbles and stated the practical problem. The body couldn't stay in the bedroom, or it would start to smell. Sue nearly shouted that this was a terrible thing to say. He asked Julie if that meant they shouldn't tell anybody. Julie walked off without answering. He watched her go inside, splash her face at the sink, hold her head under the cold tap until her hair was soaked, then wring it out and sweep it from her face. Water ran onto her shoulders as she returned. She sat on the rockery and said that if they weren't going to tell anyone, they had to do something themselves quickly. Sue was close to tears, moaning about what they could possibly do. Julie, despite her shaking voice, said very quietly, bury her, of course. He felt a thrill of horror and agreed they could have a private funeral. Sue wept steadily now. Julie put an arm around Sue's shoulder and looked coldly at him over her head. He grew suddenly irritated with both of them, got up, and walked to the front of the house to check on Tom. Tom sat with another boy in the pile of yellow sand by the front gate, digging a system of fist-sized tunnels. Tom's friend squinted up at him derisively, repeating Tom's claim that his mom had just died. The friend insisted it wasn't true. He told the boy it was true. She was his mom too, and she had just died. Tom sneered in triumph and plunged his wrists into the sand. The friend thought for a moment, then announced that his own mom wasn't dead. Tom said he didn't care. The boy repeated the statement to him. He asked, so what? The boy yelled that she wasn't. He composed his face, knelt in the sand, and placed a hand sympathetically on the boy's shoulder. Quietly, he told the boy he had just come from his house. His dad had said his mom was dead. She'd come out looking for him, and a car ran her over. Tom crowed in delight. The boy said to himself that she wasn't. He hissed that he was telling the truth. His dad was pretty upset and really angry with him because his mom got run over while looking for him. The boy stood up, face drained of color. He advised the boy not to go home. His dad would be after him. The boy ran up the garden path to the front door, then remembered, turned, and ran back past them, already starting to blubber. Tom shouted after him, but his friend just shook his head and kept running. Once dark fell and everyone was indoors, Tom became fearful and miserable again. He cried when they tried to put him to bed, so they let him stay up, hoping he'd fall asleep on the sofa. He whined and cried over the smallest things, making it impossible to discuss their plan. They ended up talking around him, shouting over his head. While Tom screamed and stamped because there was no orange squash left, and Sue tried to quiet him, he asked Julie rapidly where they should put the body. She said something lost to Tom's squeals, then repeated it. In the garden, under the rockery. Later, Tom cried simply for his mother. While he tried to comfort Tom, he saw Julie explaining something to Sue, who nodded and rubbed her eyes. As he attempted to distract Tom with talk of the sand tunnels, his own idea suddenly arrived. He lost track of what he was saying, and Tom began crying loudly again. Tom didn't fall asleep until after midnight. Only then could he tell his sisters he didn't think the garden was a good plan. They'd have to dig deep. It would take a long time. In daylight, someone would see them. At night, they'd need torches and might be spotted from the tower blocks. And how would they keep it from Tom? He paused for effect. Despite everything, he was enjoying himself. He'd always admired the gentleman criminals in films who discussed the perfect murder with elegant detachment. As he spoke, he touched the key in his pocket, and his stomach turned. He went on confidently. If someone came looking, digging up the garden was the first thing they'd do. You read about that sort of thing every day. Julie watched him closely, taking him seriously. When he finished, she simply asked, "Well then?" They left Sue in the kitchen with Tom. Sue wasn't angry or horrified by his idea. She was too miserable to care, shaking her head slowly like a sad old lady. Outside, moonlight was enough to find the wheelbarrow and a shovel. They pushed it to the front garden and filled it with sand. 6 loads went down the coal hole into the cellar. Then they stood outside the kitchen arguing about water. He said they'd need buckets. Julie said there was a tap down there. They finally found it in the small room filled with old clothes and toys. Because it was farther from the bedroom, the cellar felt less frightening to him than the rest of the house. Obscurely, he felt entitled to do the shoveling and mixing, but Julie already had the shovel and had made a pile of sand. She split open a cement sack and waited for him to fetch water. She worked fast, turning and folding the huge pile until it became stiff gray sludge. He lifted the lid of the great tin chest, and Julie shoveled the cement in, 5 inches deep on the bottom. They agreed to do another, larger load. This time he mixed while Julie fetched water. As he worked, the whole purpose of what they were doing never crossed his mind. Nothing felt odd about mixing cement. When the second pile was in the chest, they had been working 3 hours. They went upstairs to drink water. Sue slept in an armchair. Tom lay face down on the sofa. They covered Sue with a coat and returned to the cellar. The chest was now almost half full. They decided that before bringing the body down, they should have a really big pile of cement ready. This one took a long time. They ran out of sand. With only one shovel, they both went out into the garden again. The sky was already lightening in the east. 5 journeys with the wheelbarrow. He wondered aloud what they'd tell Tom when he came out in the morning to find his sand gone. Julie mimicked him, blowed away, and they giggled tiredly. Their final mix was ready at 5 o'clock. They hadn't looked at or spoken to each other for almost an hour. He took the key from his pocket. Julie said she thought she lost that and he'd had it all along. He followed her up the cellar stairs to the kitchen. They rested and drank more water. In the living room, they pushed furniture aside and propped the door open with a shoe. Upstairs, he turned the key and pushed open the door, but Julie stepped in first. She started to turn on the light, then changed her mind. The grayish-blue light made everything flat, two-dimensional, like stepping into an old photograph of their mother's bedroom. He didn't look immediately toward the bed. The air felt damp and stuffy, as though several people had been sleeping with the windows closed. Beyond that closeness hung a faint, sharp odor, noticeable only at the top of a breath when the lungs were full. He took shallow breaths through his nose. Their mother lay exactly as they'd left her, the image that had been presenting itself every time he closed his eyes. Julie stood at the foot of the bed hugging herself. He stepped nearer and abandoned any idea that they could ever pick her up. He waited for Julie, but she didn't move. He admitted they couldn't do it. Julie's voice came out high-pitched and strained, rapid, pretending to be cheerful and efficient. She suggested wrapping the body in the sheet. It wouldn't be so bad if they did it quickly. Still, she didn't move. He sat at the table with his back to the bed. Instantly, Julie's anger flared. She accused him of leaving it to her, asked why he didn't do something first. He asked what. She told him to roll the body in the sheet. It was his plan, wasn't it? He wanted to sleep. He closed his eyes and felt a sharp falling sensation, clutching the table and standing up. Julie spoke more gently then. If they spread the sheet on the floor, they could lift the body onto it. He strode toward his mother and pulled the sheet off her. When he spread it on the floor, it settled in such dreamy slow motion, corners billowing and folding, that he gasped with impatience. He caught his mother by the shoulder, half closed his eyes, and pushed her off the table back onto the bed. He avoided her face. She seemed to resist him. It took both hands to make her move. Now she lay on her side, arms at odd angles, body twisted and fixed in the position she'd been in since the day before yesterday. Julie took her feet. He held behind her shoulders. When they set her down on the sheet, she looked so frail and sad in her nightdress, lying at their feet like a bird with a broken wing, that for the first time he cried for her, and not for himself. Behind her on the bed, she left a large brown stain, whose outer edges faded to yellow. Julie's face was wet too when they knelt by their mother and tried to roll her in the sheet. It was difficult. Her body was too twisted to turn. Julie cried out in exasperation that she wouldn't go. Finally, they managed to tuck the sheet around her loosely a couple of times. Once she was covered, it became a little easier. They picked her up and carried her out of the bedroom. They carried the body down one step at a time. At the bottom, in the downstairs hall, they rearranged the sheet where it had come loose. His wrists ached. Neither spoke, but both understood they wanted to get her across the living room without setting her down. They were almost to the kitchen door on the far side when he glanced, left toward Sue's chair. She sat with the coat pulled up to her chin, watching them pass. He thought about whispering something, but couldn't come up with anything before they were through the kitchen door and edging around to the cellar stairs. They set her down several feet from the trunk. He fetched a bucket of water to moisten the huge pile of cement. When he looked up from mixing, Sue stood in the doorway. He thought she might try to stop them, but when he and Julie stood ready to lift the body, Sue came and took hold of the middle. Because the body wouldn't lie straight, there was barely enough space in the trunk. It sank an inch or two into the cement already there. He turned for the shovel, but Julie already had it. As she emptied the first load of wet cement onto their mother's feet, Sue let out a small cry. Then, as Julie refilled the shovel, Sue hurried to the pile, scooped up as much cement as she could with both hands, and threw it into the trunk. Then she threw cement as fast as she could. Julie shoveled faster too, staggering to the trunk with huge loads and running back for more. He plunged his hands into the cement and threw in a heavy armload. They worked like maniacs. Soon, only a few patches of the sheet remained visible. Then those disappeared too. Still, they kept going. The only sounds were the scrape of the shovel and their heavy breathing. When they finished, when nothing remained of the pile but a damp path on the floor, the cement in the trunk was almost overflowing. Before going back upstairs, they stood looking at what they'd done, catching their breath. They decided to leave the lid up so the cement would harden faster. 2 or 3 years before their father died, their parents had attended the funeral of one of their last surviving relatives, maybe a mother's aunt, or a father's, or an uncle. Exactly who died wasn't discussed, probably because the death meant little to the parents. It meant nothing to the children. They were more interested in being left alone in charge of Tom for most of the day. Mother prepared them several days in advance. She would cook their lunch. All they had to do was warm it up. She showed each of them, Julie, Sue, then him, how to operate the stove, and made them promise to check 3 times that it was properly turned off. She changed her mind and said she'd prepare a cold lunch. But that wouldn't do, she finally decided, because it was winter and they couldn't go without something hot midday. Father in turn told them what to do if someone knocked at the front door, though no one ever had. He instructed them on what to do if the house caught fire, not to stay and fight it, but to run to the telephone kiosk and under no circumstances to forget Tom. They were not to play in the cellar, not to plug in the electric iron, not to put fingers in electric sockets. When they took Tom to the lavatory, they had to hold on to him the whole time. They repeated these instructions solemnly until every detail was correct, then gathered by the front door to watch their parents walk to the bus stop in black clothes. Every few yards, the parents turned anxiously and waved. The children waved cheerily back. When they were out of sight, Julie slammed the front door with her foot, let out a whoop of delight, and in the same movement whipped around and delivered a low, hard punch to his ribs. The blow knocked him back against the wall. Julie ran up the stairs 3 at a time and looked down at him, laughing. He and Sue flew after her. Upstairs, they had a wild, violent pillow fight. Later, he made a barricade at the top of the stairs with mattresses and chairs, which his sister stormed from below. Sue filled a balloon with water and threw it at his head. Tom stood at the foot of the stairs, grinning and lurching. An hour later, in his excitement, Tom soiled his pants, and a rare, sharp smell drifted upstairs and interrupted their fight. Julie and Sue sided together. They said he should deal with it because he was the same sex as Tom. He appealed uneasily to the nature of things and said that, as girls, it was obviously their duty to do something. Nothing was resolved, and the wild battle continued. Soon, Tom began to wail. They broke off again, picked Tom up, carried him to his bedroom, and put him in his large brass cot. Julie fetched his harness and tied him down. His screams turned deafening, his face bright pink. They raised the side of the cot and hurried out, anxious to escape the smell and screams. Once Tom's bedroom door was shut, they could hardly hear a thing, and carried on their games quite undisturbed. It was only a few hours, but that time seemed to occupy a whole stretch of his childhood. Half an hour before their parents were due back, giggling at the peril they were in, they started to clear the mess. Between them, they cleaned Tom up. They discovered the lunch they'd been too busy to eat and tipped it down the lavatory. That evening, their shared secret made them delirious. In their pajamas, they huddled together in Julie's bedroom and talked about how they would do it again soon. When their mother died, beneath his strongest feelings lay a sense of adventure and freedom he hardly dared admit to himself, derived from the memory of that day years ago. But there was no excitement now. The days were too long, too hot. The house seemed to have fallen asleep. They didn't even sit outside because the wind blew a fine black dust from the direction of the tower blocks and the main roads behind them. Even while it was hot, the sun never quite broke through a high yellowish cloud. Everything he looked at merged and seemed insignificant in the glare. Tom was the only one content, at least in the daytime. He had his friend, the one he played with in the sand. Tom didn't seem to notice the sand was gone, nor did his friend ever mention the story he told about his mother. They played farther up the road, in and out of the ruined prefabs. In the evenings, after his friend went home, Tom grew bad-tempered and cried easily. He went to Julie most often when he wanted attention, and he got on her nerves. She would snap at him not to keep asking, to get away from her just for a minute, but it made little difference. Tom had decided Julie was to take care of him now. He trailed her around the house grizzling and ignored Sue or him when they tried to divert him. One early evening, when Tom was being particularly demanding and Julie more irritable than usual, she suddenly seized hold of him in the living room and tore his clothes off. She kept saying he'd had it. Sue asked what she was doing. Julie shouted that if he wanted to be mothered, he could start doing what she told him. He was going to bed. It was hardly 5 in the afternoon. When Tom was naked, she dragged him by the arm to the bathroom. From there, they heard his screams and bath water running. 10 minutes later, Tom was back before them in pajamas, utterly subdued, and allowed Julie to lead him upstairs to his bedroom. She came down, banging imaginary dust from her palms and smiling widely, saying that was what he wanted. He replied that was what she was best at giving. It came out more sourly than he intended. Julie kicked his foot gently, murmured a warning that he be next. As soon as they'd finished in the cellar, he and Julie had gone to bed. Because Sue had slept part of the night, she stayed up and looked after Tom during the day. He woke in the late afternoon extremely thirsty and hot. No one was downstairs, but he could hear Tom's voice somewhere outside. As he stooped to drink water from the kitchen tap, a cloud of flies hummed around his face. He walked on the sides of his bare feet because the floor near the sink was covered with something yellow and sticky, probably spilled orange juice. Still lightheaded from sleep, he went upstairs to Sue's room. She sat across her bed with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, an open notebook in her lap. She put down her pencil when he came in and snapped the book shut. The room felt stuffy, as if she'd been in here for hours. He sat on the edge of her bed, quite near her. He felt like talking, but not about the night before. He wanted someone to stroke his head. Sue pressed her thin lips together, determined not to speak first. He asked what she was doing, staring at the notebook. She said nothing, just writing, holding the notebook in two hands against her belly. He asked what she was writing. She sighed and repeated that it was nothing, just writing. He tore the book from her hands, turned his back, and opened it. Before she blocked his view with her arm, he had time to read at the top of a page. "Tuesday, dear Mom." Sue shouted at him to give it back, her voice so unfamiliar, so unexpectedly violent, that he let her take it. She shoved the notebook under her pillow and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall in front of her. Her face was red, her freckles darker. The pulse in her temple stood out and beat angrily. He shrugged and decided to leave, but she didn't look up. When he was through the door, she pushed it shut and locked it. As he walked away, he heard her crying. He knocked and called to her. Through her sobs, she told him to go away, so he did. He went to the bathroom and washed the dried cement from his hands. For a week after the burial, they didn't eat a cooked meal. Julie went to the post office for money and came home with bags of shopping, but the vegetables and meat she bought lay untouched until they had to be thrown away. Instead, they ate bread, cheese, peanut butter, biscuits, and fruit. Tom gorged on chocolate bars and didn't seem to need much else. When someone felt like making it, they drank tea, but mostly water from the tap. The day Julie bought the shopping, she gave him and Sue £2 each. He asked how much she was getting. She snapped her purse shut and said the same as them. The rest was for food and stuff. Soon, the kitchen became a place of stench and clouds of flies. None of them felt like doing anything about it beyond keeping the door shut. It was too hot. Then someone, not him, threw the meat out. Encouraged, he cleaned some milk bottles, gathered empty wrappers, and swatted a dozen or so flies. That same night, Julie told him and Sue it was time they did something about the kitchen. He said he'd done a lot in there that day, which they didn't seem to have noticed. The girls laughed. Sue asked what, and when he told them, they laughed again, louder than necessary. They said to each other that he'd done his bit for a few weeks. He decided then to have nothing more to do with the kitchen, which made Julie and Sue determined not to clean it either. Not until they cooked a meal several days later was anything finally done. In the meantime, the flies spread through the house, hanging in thin clouds by the windows, making a constant clicking sound as they threw themselves against the glass. He masturbated each morning and afternoon and drifted through the house from one room to another, sometimes surprised to find himself in his bedroom lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, when he'd intended to go out into the garden. He looked at himself carefully in the mirror. What was wrong with him? He tried to frighten himself with the reflection of his eyes, but felt only impatience and mild revulsion. He stood in the center of his room listening to the very distant, constant sound of traffic. Then, to the voices of children playing in the street. The two sounds merged and seemed to press down on the top of his head. He lay on the bed again and closed his eyes. When a fly walked across his face, he was determined not to move. He couldn't bear to remain on the bed, yet any activity he thought of disgusted him in advance. To stir himself, he thought of his mother downstairs. She was no more to him than a fact. He got up and went to the window, looking out across the parched weeds to the tower blocks. Then he looked through the house to see if Julie was back. She frequently disappeared, usually in the afternoons for hours. When he asked where she went, she told him to mind his own business. Julie wasn't in. Sue had locked herself in her room. If he knocked, she'd ask what he wanted, and he wouldn't know what to tell her. He remembered the £2. He left by the back, climbed the fence so Tom wouldn't see him and want to come along. For no particular reason, he set off at a run toward the shops. He had no idea what he wanted. He thought he'd know when he saw it. Even if it cost more than £2, at least he'd have something to want, something to think about. He ran all the way. The main shopping street was empty, except for cars. Sunday. The only person he could see was a woman in a red coat standing on a footbridge spanning the road. He wondered why she wore a red coat in such heat. Perhaps she was wondering why he'd been running. She seemed to be staring in his direction. She was still a long way off, but looked familiar. Could be a teacher from his school. He walked toward the footbridge because he didn't want to turn back so soon, staring into shop windows on his left. He didn't like meeting school teachers in the street. He thought he could pass beneath her if she was still there and pretend not to have seen her. But 50 yards from the bridge, he couldn't resist glancing up. The woman was his mother, looking right at him. He stopped. She'd shifted her weight but didn't move from her position. He started toward her again. It was hard to make his legs move. His heart beat so fast, he was certain he'd be sick. When he was almost under the footbridge, he stopped again and looked up. Great relief and recognition swept through him, and he laughed out loud. It wasn't Mother, of course. It was Julie, wearing a coat he'd never seen before. He called up to her, started to explain, and ran under the bridge and up the wooden stairs. Face to face, he saw it wasn't Julie either. A thin face, straggling grayish-black hair. He couldn't tell if she was young or old. She put her hands deep into her pockets, swayed slightly, and said she didn't have any money, so he shouldn't come near her. As he walked home, his blankness returned. Significance drained from the event of his day. He went straight upstairs to his bedroom, and although he didn't meet or hear anyone, he knew the others were in. He took off all his clothes and lay under the sheet on his bed. Sometime later, he woke from a heavy sleep to the sound of shrill laughter. Curious, he didn't move at first, preferred to listen. Julie's and Sue's voices. At the end of each burst of laughter, they made a sighing, singing sound that merged into words he couldn't make out. Then the laughter began again. He felt irritable after his sudden sleep. His head felt tight and shrunken. The objects in the room seemed too dense, locked hard into the space they occupied, bulging with strain. His clothes, before he picked them up and put them on, could have been made of steel. When dressed, he stood outside his bedroom listening. He heard only the murmur of one voice and the creak of a chair. He went down the stairs as quietly as possible, seized by a strong wish to spy on his sisters, to be with them and invisible. The large downstairs hallway was completely dark. He stood a little back from the open living room door without being seen. Sue sat at the table, cutting something with large scissors. Julie stood partly obscured by the doorframe, back to him. Her arm moved forward and back with a faint, rasping sound. Just as he moved to see better, a little girl stepped in front of Julie and went to stand by Sue's elbow. Julie turned and stood behind the girl, one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a hairbrush. They remained grouped like this without talking. When Sue turned slightly, he saw she was cutting blue cloth. The little girl leaned backward against Julie, who clasped her hands under the girl's chin and tapped her gently on the chest with the brush. As soon as the girl spoke, he knew it was Tom. Tom remarked that it took a long time. Sue nodded. He took a couple of paces into the room and wasn't noticed. Tom and Julie were intent on watching Sue alter one of her school skirts. She'd cut it shorter and was beginning to sew. Tom wore an orange dress that looked familiar, and from somewhere they'd found him a wig. His hair was fair and thick with curls. How easy it was to be someone else. He crossed his arms and hugged himself. They're only clothes and a wig, he thought. It is Tom dressed up. But he was looking at another person, someone who could expect a life quite different from Tom's. Excited and scared, he squeezed his hands together. The movement made all three turn and look at him. After a pause, he asked what they were doing. Sue said, dressing him up, and turned back to her sewing. Tom glanced at him, half turned toward the table, then stared fixedly into one corner of the room, playing with the hem of his dress, rolling the material between his fingers. He asked what the point was. Julie shrugged and smiled. She wore faded jeans rolled above her knees and an unbuttoned shirt over her bikini top, a blue ribbon tied in her hair, another piece wound around her finger. Julie came and stood right in front of him, telling him to cheer up. Misery. She smelled sweetly of suntan oil. He could feel the warmth her skin gave off. She must have been out in the sun all day somewhere. She unwound the ribbon from her finger and draped it around his neck. He pushed her hands away when she started to tie a bow under his chin, but did it without conviction. She persisted and finished the knot. She took his hand, and he followed her to the table. She announced to Sue that here was another one tired of being a grumpy boy. He would have untied the ribbon, but didn't wish to let go of Julie's hand. Dry and cool. Now they all watched over Sue's shoulder. He'd never realized how skillful she was at sewing. Her hand flew back and forth in the same regular motion like a shuttle on a mechanical loom. Yet her actual progress was slow, and he felt great impatience. He wanted to sweep the cloth, needle, and pins to the floor in one movement. They would have to wait until she finished before they could speak, or anything else could happen. Finally, Sue broke the cotton with a sharp tug of her wrists and stood up. Julie let go of his hand and stood behind Tom. Tom raised his hands, and Julie lifted the dress over his head. Underneath, he wore his own white shirt. Sue helped Tom into the blue pleated skirt, and Julie knotted one of Sue's school ties around his neck. He watched and fingered his blue ribbon. If he took it off now, he would become a spectator again. He would have to decide on an attitude toward what was happening. Tom put on white socks, and Sue fetched her beret. The girls laughed and chatted while making these preparations. Sue told Julie a story about a friend at school who'd cut her hair very short, came into school in trousers, went into the boys' changing room, saw them all at the urinals, burst out laughing at the sight, and gave herself away. Julie asked if Tom wasn't pretty. While they gazed at him, Tom stood perfectly still with his hands behind his back and his eyes lowered. If he enjoyed being dressed up, he didn't really show it. He went into the hallway to admire himself in the full-length mirror. He watched through the doorway as Tom stood sideways to his reflection, staring at himself over his shoulder. While Tom was out of the room, Julie took both his hands in hers and asked what they were going to do with Grumpy. Her eyes roved over his face. She said he wouldn't make a pretty girl like Tom with horrible spots like those. Sue, now at his elbow, tugged a strand of his hair and pointed out his long, greasy hair that he never washed. Julie added his yellow teeth, and Sue added his smelly feet. Julie turned his hands palms down and noted his filthy fingernails. The girls examined his nails with exaggerated disgust. He was rather enjoying being examined. Sue touched his forefinger, pointing out green and red underneath it. They laughed, taking delight in everything they found. He spotted a long cardboard box under a chair, lid half off, white tissue paper spilling out. Sue cried that it was Julie's. He strode across, pulled the box clear, and found calf-length boots inside, deep brown, giving off a rich smell of leather and perfume. Julie, back turned, slowly folded the orange dress Tom had worn. He held up a boot and asked where she got them. She said in a shop. He asked how much. Not much, she said. Sue excitedly whispered that they cost 38 pounds. He asked if she'd paid that. Julie shook her head and put the dress under her arm. He tried to yank the ridiculous ribbon from his neck, but the bow turned into a knot. Sue laughed. Julie walked out. He accused her of stealing them. She shook her head again. Still holding the boot, he followed her upstairs. In her bedroom, he said she'd given him and Sue 2 pounds each, then spent 38 on boots. Julie sat before a mirror fixed to the wall, brushing her hair. She told him he was wrong, her voice chiming as if they were playing a guessing game. He threw the boot on the bed and used 2 hands to break the ribbon. The knot grew smaller and hard like a stone. Julie stretched and yawned. He said if she didn't buy them, she must have nicked them. She said nope, mouth pursed in a mocking smile. He asked what then, standing right behind her. She asked if he couldn't think of another way. He shook his head, saying there wasn't another way unless she made them herself. Julie laughed and asked if no one had ever given him a present. He asked who gave them to her. A friend, she said. He pressed for who. She said that would be telling. He guessed a bloke. Julie stood and turned to face him, lips small and tight like a berry. She admitted, of course, it was a bloke. He had a confused notion that, as her brother, he had a right to ask about her boyfriend, but nothing about Julie supported that idea. He felt more dejected than curious. She picked up nail scissors, cut the ribbon close to the knot, pulled it free, let it fall, said there, and kissed him lightly on the mouth. 3 weeks after their mother died, he began rereading the book Sue had given him for his birthday. He was surprised how much he'd missed, how particular Commander Hunt was about keeping the ship clean, especially on long journeys. Each Earth Day Hunt inspected the mess room, finding cigarette ends, plastic cutlery, magazines, coffee cups, and spilled coffee. Without gravity to keep things in place, Hunt told new computer technicians they must make an extra effort to be neat. During long hours, with no urgent decisions, Hunt passed the time reading masterpieces of world literature and writing in a steel-bound journal, while his faithful hound, Cosmo, dozed at his feet. The spaceship sped across the universe at 1/100th the speed of light, searching for the energy source that had transformed spores into a monster. He wondered if Hunt would have cared about the mess room or literature if the ship had remained perfectly still in outer space. As soon as he finished the book, he took it downstairs to give to Julie or Sue. He wanted someone else to read it. He found Julie alone in the living room, feet tucked under her, smoking. He said he didn't know she smoked. She nodded curtly and took another drag. He approached, put the book in her hand, and told her she should read it. Julie stared at the cover, the monster attacking the spaceship, Commander Hunt's ship racing to the rescue. He hadn't examined the cover closely before. Now it looked ridiculous. He felt ashamed, as if he'd painted it himself. Julie handed it back over her shoulder, holding one corner. He admitted the cover wasn't much, but said it had really good things. Julie shook her head, blew smoke across the room, and said it wasn't her sort of book. He walked around to face her, asking how she knew what sort it was. She shrugged and said she didn't feel much like reading anyway. He insisted she would if she started. She leaned forward, took the book, and agreed to read it if he really wanted, speaking as if to a child about to cry. Angry, he said not to read it, just to please him, and tried to take it back. She moved it out of reach with a smile, saying, "Of course not." He grabbed her wrist and twisted it. She transferred the book to her other hand and tucked it under herself, telling him he was hurting her. He demanded it back. It wasn't her sort of book, pulled her sideways, and took it without further struggle. Julie stared, rubbing her wrist, almost whispering to ask what was wrong with him, saying he ought to be locked up. He ignored her and sat down. They sat in silence on opposite sides of the room for a long time. Julie lit another cigarette. He looked at passages, but took nothing in. He wanted to say something conciliatory before leaving, but could think of nothing that didn't sound stupid. Besides, he told himself, she'd asked for it. The day before, he'd made Tom cry by flicking his head with his fingernail. Tom had been making noise outside his bedroom door and woke him. Tom lay on the floor clutching his head, screaming so loud that Sue ran out. He said it was Tom's own fault, making noise like that first thing in the morning. Sue rubbed Tom's head and said loudly over the screams that it was almost 1 o'clock, not first thing. He shouted that it was still first thing for him and went back to bed. As far as he was concerned, there wasn't much point in getting up. Nothing interesting to eat. He was the only one with nothing to do. Tom played outside all day. Sue stayed in her room reading and writing in her notebook. Julie went out with whoever gave her the boots. When not out, she was getting ready. Long baths that filled the house with a sweet smell stronger than the kitchen, washing and brushing her hair, doing things to her eyes, wearing clothes he'd never seen before, a silk blouse and brown velvet skirt. He woke late, masturbated, dozed off again. He had bad dreams he struggled to wake from. He spent his 2 pounds on fish and chips. When he asked Julie for more, she handed over a 5-pound note without a word. During the day, he listened to the radio. He thought about returning to school at the end of summer and about getting a job. He wasn't drawn to either. Some afternoons he fell asleep in the armchair, even though he'd only been awake a couple of hours. He looked in the mirror and saw the spots on his face spreading down his neck. He wondered if they'd cover his whole body, and didn't much care if they did. Finally, Julie cleared her throat and said, "Well?" He looked past her at the kitchen door and suddenly said, "Let's clean the kitchen. Exactly the right thing." Julie stood immediately, did an imitation of a film gangster with a cigarette. Dangling, said now he was talking, took his hand and pulled him out of his chair. He offered to get Sue. Julie shook her head. Julie leaped into the kitchen with an imaginary Sten gun at her hip, shooting the place apart. All the mold-covered plates, the flies and blue bottles, the collapsed pile of rubbish spread across the floor. She made the same stuttering throat noises Tom used in his gun games. He stood wondering whether to join in. Julie whipped around and filled his belly with bullets. He collapsed at her feet, a butter wrapper inches from his nose. She took a handful of his hair, pulled his head back, swapped her gun for a knife, pressed it to his throat, and warned that any more trouble, and she'd stick it in there. Then she knelt, pressed her fist near his groin, whispered dramatically, "Or here," and they both laughed. Her game ended very suddenly. They began sweeping rubbish into cardboard boxes and carrying them to the dustbins. Sue heard and came down to help. They unblocked drains, washed walls, scrubbed floors. While he and Sue washed dishes, Julie went out for food. They finished just as she returned and began cutting vegetables for a large stew. Once it was simmering, Julie and Sue tied-eyed the living room while he went outside to clean the windows. Through a film of water, he saw his sister's blurred shapes moving all furniture to the center of the room. For the first time in weeks, he felt happy, safe, as if he belonged to a powerful secret army. They worked over 4 hours. He was hardly aware of his existence. He took mats and a small carpet into the garden and thrashed the dust out with a stick. He heard a sound behind him. Tom and his friend from the tower block. Tom wore Sue's school uniform, his knees bloody from a fall. Quite often now, Tom played in the street in Sue's skirt. None of the other children teased him as he'd expected. They didn't even seem to notice. He couldn't understand that. He wouldn't have been seen dead in his sister's skirt at Tom's age, or any age. Tom stood holding his friend's hand. He went on working. Around Tom's neck, the friend wore a familiar patterned scarf. They had a short conversation he couldn't hear over his noise. Then Tom loudly asked what he was doing that for. He told him and asked why Tom was wearing a skirt. Tom didn't reply. He hit the carpet a few more times, stopped, and asked the friend why Tom was wearing a skirt. The boy said in their game, Tom was being Julie. He asked who the boy was. No reply. He raised the stick, and just as he brought it down, Tom said the boy was being him. He asked if they'd said me. They both nodded. He threw the stick away and pulled the mats off the clothesline, asking what they did in their game. The friend shrugged. Nothing much. He asked if they had fights, trying to include Tom, but Tom looked elsewhere. The boy shook his head. He laid the mats and carpet on top of each other, asking if they were friends in their game, if they held hands. They pulled their hands free and laughed. Tom followed him inside, but the friend stayed outside the kitchen door, called out to Tom that he was going home, making it sound like a question. Tom nodded without turning around. In the living room, 4 plates sat on the table, a knife and fork on either side of each plate. In the center, tomato sauce and an egg cup full of salt. A chair for each plate. He thought, as if we were real people. Tom went upstairs to Julie. He and Sue walked back and forth between kitchen and living room like Commander Hunt inspecting the mess room. Twice, he bent to pick fluff off the carpet. On a hook on the cellar door hung a brightly colored string shopping bag with 2 apples and 2 oranges at the bottom. He pushed the bag, making it swing like a pendulum. It moved more freely one direction than the other. It took him a while to realize this was due to the handle shape. Without thinking, he pulled the cellar door open, turned on the light, and ran down the stairs. The shovel lay in the center of a large round stain of dried cement, reminding him of the hour hand of a broken clock. He tried to remember which of them had used it last, but had no clear memory of events. He picked it up and leaned it against the wall. The trunk lid was open as they'd left it. He remembered that. He ran his hand across the pale gray concrete filling the trunk, warm to the touch, a fine dust rubbing onto his skin. A hairline crack ran diagonally across the surface, forking at one end. He knelt and sniffed. A very distinct, sweet smell, but when he stood, he realized it was the stew cooking upstairs. He sat on a stool by the trunk and thought about his mother. He tried hard to picture her face. He had the oval outline, but the features inside wouldn't stay still. They dissolved into each other, the oval turning into a light bulb. When he closed his eyes, he actually saw a light bulb. Once her face appeared briefly framed by the oval, smiling unnaturally the way she did when posing for snapshots. He made up sentences and tried to make her say them, but nothing sounded right. Simple things, like, "Pass me that book," or "Good night," didn't sound like things she would say. Was her voice low or high? Had she ever made a joke? She'd been dead less than a month, and she was in the trunk beside him. Even that wasn't certain. He wanted to dig her out and see. He ran his fingernail along the crack. It wasn't clear now why they'd put her in the trunk in the first place. At the time, it had been obvious, to keep the family together. Was that a good reason? It might have been more interesting to be apart. Nor could he decide whether what they'd done was ordinary, understandable, even if a mistake. Like his picture of her face, every thought dissolved into nothing. The impossibility of knowing or feeling anything for certain gave him a great urge to masturbate. He put his hands into his pants, glanced down between his legs, and saw something red. He leaped up. The stool he was sitting on was bright red, painted long ago by his father, belonging in the downstairs bathroom. Julie or Sue must have brought it down to sit by the trunk. Instead of comforting him, it frightened him. They hardly spoke to each other about their mother. She was everyone's secret. Even Tom rarely mentioned her, and only occasionally cried for her now. He looked around the cellar for other signs, but found nothing. He left. Starting up the steps, he saw Sue at the top watching him. She said she thought that was him down there, a plate in her hand. He mentioned the crack. She said it was getting bigger, but guess what? He shrugged. She showed him the plate and announced someone was coming to tea. He pushed past her into the kitchen. No one there. Sue turned out the cellar light and locked the door. He asked who. Sue was very excited. Derek, Julie's bloke. In the living room, he watched her set the extra plates. She took him to the foot of the stairs, pointed upward, and whispered for him to listen. He heard Julie's voice, then a man's voice in answer. Both talked at once. Both laughed. He told Sue so what, big deal. But his heart raced. He lay across an armchair and started whistling randomly, in a panic, gradually settling on a tune. Sue sat down too, wiping imaginary sweat from her brow, saying it was lucky they'd cleaned up. Tom came in from upstairs carrying his wig like a large cat. He asked Sue to put it on him. She held him away, pointed at his bloody knees and hands, and refused until he'd washed. While Tom was in the bathroom, he asked Sue what Derek was like. She said he had a car, a new one, and pointed toward the window. He didn't look. When Tom returned, Sue suggested if he wanted to be a girl at tea, why not wear the orange dress? Tom shook his head. Sue fitted the wig. Tom ran to the hall mirror, then sat opposite and picked his nose. Sue read a book. He began whistling again, more softly. Tom wiped a find on a chair cushion. He sometimes did that himself, but only when alone, usually in bed in the morning. It doesn't look so bad when a little girl does it, he thought, and went to the window. A sports car, old-fashioned, with a running board and a leather hood folded back, bright red with a thin black line its whole length. Sue said he should go look at it. It was fantastic. He asked at what. The wheels had silver spokes. The exhaust pipes were silver too. Long slanting cuts in the metal along the hood. He imagined explaining to a passenger that they let the air in, or the heat out, as he swung through a tight alpine bend. When he returned to his chair, Sue had disappeared. He stared at Tom. In the large armchair, Tom looked tiny, feet just sticking over the edge, head halfway up the backrest. Tom stared back briefly, looked away, folded his arms, his legs splayed under his skirt. He asked what it was like being a girl. Tom shook his head and shifted. He asked if it was better than being a boy. Dunno. He asked if it made him feel sexy. Tom laughed suddenly. He didn't understand, but knew the word was a signal to laugh. He asked again. Tom grinned and said, Dunno. He leaned forward, wiggled his finger to bring Tom closer, and asked when Tom put on the wig and skirt and went to the mirror and saw a little girl. Did he get a nice feeling in his dinky? Did it get bigger? Tom's grin faded. He climbed off the armchair and slipped out. He remained still, aware of the stew smell. The ceiling creaked. He arranged himself in his chair, crossed his ankles, clasped his hands under his chin. Light, fast footsteps on the stairs. Tom ran in, announcing loudly that they were coming. He was coming. He asked who, moving his hands behind his head. Julie's voice came from the doorway, introducing Derek and then him. He shook hands without standing up, but uncrossed his legs and put his feet firmly on the floor. Neither spoke during the handshake. Afterward, Derek cleared his throat and looked at Julie, who stood right behind Tom, hands pressing down on his shoulders. She introduced Tom in a way that made it obvious she'd already spoken to Derek about him. Derek moved behind his chair, where he couldn't be seen, and quietly remarked, "A Tom girl." Sue made a half-hearted laugh. He stood up. Julie went to fetch the stew and called Tom to help. The three of them, himself, Sue, and Derek, stood in the center of the room rather close, seeming to sway a little together. Sue deliberately made her voice breathless and stupid, saying they really liked Derek's car. Derek nodded. He was very tall, dressed as if for a wedding. Pale gray suit, cream shirt and tie, cufflinks, a waistcoat with a small silver chain. He said he didn't like it much. Derek turned to him with a faint smile. A thick black mustache, so perfect it could have been plastic. Derek asked why not. Too flash, he said. He didn't like red. Derek glanced at his shoes. He continued, "Red made cars look like toys." Derek stepped away, hands deep in his pockets, rocking back on his heels, and quietly said that when he was older, he'd realize that's all they were. Toys. Expensive toys. He asked why they were toys when they were useful for getting about. Derek nodded, looked around the room, and remarked to Sue that these were big rooms, a really big house. Sue said her room was quite small. He folded his arms and persisted, "If cars were toys, then everything you bought was a toy." Julie entered with the stew, followed by Tom carrying bread and a pepper pot. Derek said he'd have to think about that one and moved a chair out of Julie's way. Before sitting, he noticed Julie wore her new boots, the velvet skirt, and the silk blouse. She and Derek sat next to each other. He sat at a corner next to Tom. At first, too irritated to feel hungry, when Julie passed him a plate, he said he didn't want it. She told him not to be silly, put the plate down, and smiled at Derek, who nodded in understanding. While they ate, Julie and Sue did all the talking. Derek sat perfectly upright, spread a red and blue handkerchief over his lap, dabbed his mustache after finishing, then folded it carefully before pocketing it. He wanted to see them touch each other. Julie rested her head on the crook of Derek's elbow and asked for the salt. He reached the egg cup first and snatched it across to his sister, spilling salt the length of the table. Derek softly told him to be careful. The girls began a jumpy conversation about throwing salt over shoulders and walking under ladders. At one point, Derek winked at Tom, who lowered his head so his curls hid his face. Afterward, Julie took Derek into the garden. He and Sue washed dishes. He did no more than stand with a dishcloth in his hand. They watched through the kitchen window. Julie pointed to the little paths and steps now almost invisible under tangled brownish weeds. Derek pointed toward the tower blocks and made a wide sweep with his arm, as if ordering them to collapse. Julie nodded seriously. Sue remarked on his broad shoulders, guessing he'd had that suit made specially. They stared at Derek's back, his head small and round, hair all the same length like a brush. He said Derek wasn't so strong and pretty thick. Sue lifted wet plates, looking for somewhere to put them, and said Derek could beat him up with his little finger. He cried out, "Let him try." A little later, Julie and Derek sat by the rockery. Sue took the cloth and started drying, saying he'd never guess what Derek did. He said he didn't give a fuck. Sue revealed Derek was a snooker player who played for money, incredibly rich. He looked at Derek again, sitting sideways, listening to Julie, pulling up a long stalk of grass, biting off small pieces and spitting them out, nodding at what she said. When Derek finally spoke, he rested a hand lightly on Julie's shoulder, making her laugh. Sue added that there'd been something about him in the paper, the local weekly. He laughed, saying everyone got written about in that if they lived long enough. Sue asked if he knew how old Derek was. He made no reply. 23, Sue said proudly, and smiled at him. He wanted to hit her, asking what was so amazing about that. Sue dried her hands and said it was a perfect age for a bloke. He asked, "Who said Sue?" Hesitated, then said Julie. He gasped, ran out of the kitchen, paused in the living room to look for Commander Hunt, tidied away into a bookshelf, ran upstairs with the book, slammed his bedroom door, and lay down. More frequently, his bad dreams became nightmares. In one, a huge wooden box in the hallway he must have passed a dozen times before without a second thought. Now he stopped. The lid that used to be nailed tight hung loose. Some nails were bent back. The wood around them splintered and white. He stood as near as he could without seeing inside. He knew he was in a dream, and it was important not to panic. Something was in the box. He managed to open his eyes a little and saw the bottom corner of his bed before they weighed shut. Back in the hallway, closer to the box, foolishly peering in. When he tried his eyes again, they opened easily and wide. He saw the corner of his bed and some clothes. In a large armchair at the side of his bed sat his mother, staring with huge hollow eyes. That's because she's dead, he thought. She was tiny, her feet hardly touching the floor. When she spoke, her voice was so familiar he couldn't imagine how he'd forgotten it so easily. But he couldn't understand exactly what she was saying. A strange word. Drubbing or brudding. She asked couldn't he stop drubbing even while she was talking to him. He said he wasn't doing anything, then glanced down. No clothes on the bed. He was naked and masturbating in front of her. His hand flew back and forth like a shuttle on a loom. He told her he couldn't stop. It was nothing to do with him. She asked sadly what his father would say if he was alive. As he woke, he was saying aloud that they were both dead. He told this dream to Sue one afternoon. When she unlocked her door, he noticed she held her notebook open in one hand. While listening, she closed it and slid it under her pillow. To his surprise, his dream made her giggle. She asked if boys did that all the time. Drubbing. Instead of answering, he asked if she remembered when they used to play that game. When Julie and he were the doctors examining her, and she was from another planet. His sister nodded and folded her arms. He paused, having no idea what he was going to say. She asked, "What about it?" He'd come to talk about his dream and about their mother, and already they were talking about something else. He asked slowly if she wished they still played that game. Sue shook her head and looked away, saying she could hardly remember anything about it. He said Julie, and he used to take all her clothes off. It sounded unlikely as he said it. Sue shook her head again, unconvincingly asking if they did, saying she didn't really remember it that well. She wasn't very old. Then, after a silence, she added warmly that they were always playing silly games. He settled onto the edge of Sue's bed, taking in the floor littered with books, some open, face down, many of them library copies. He reached for one but stopped, suddenly exhausted by the whole idea of reading, and wondered aloud if she never tired of sitting in here all day. Sue answered that she liked reading, and besides, there was nothing else to do. He tossed out the opposite claim just to hear her insist again on the nothingness. But she only pressed her thin lips inward, that motion women use after applying lipstick, and confessed she didn't feel like doing anything else. A long silence followed. Sue whistled, and he sensed she was waiting for him to leave. From downstairs came the back door opening, then the voices of Julie and her boyfriend. He wished Sue disliked Derek the way he did. Then they'd have plenty to talk about. Sue raised her faint brows and stated the obvious. That would be them. He answered with a flat, "So what?" and felt cut off from everyone he knew. Sue went back to whistling. He flipped magazine pages, but both of them listened carefully. No one came upstairs. Water ran. Teacups rattled. He asked whether she still wrote in that book. She admitted she did. A bit, and her gaze moved toward her pillow, as though ready to stop him from grabbing it. He waited, then spoke with real sadness. He wished she would let him see the parts about their mother, just those parts. She could even read them aloud if she preferred. Downstairs, a radio blared a full-volume song about a highway, grating on him, but he kept his sad look fixed on his sister. Sue told him he wouldn't understand any of it. When he demanded to know why not, she answered quickly. He had never understood anything about their mother. He had always been horrible to her. He shouted that this was a lie, then repeated it. Sue sat straight on the bed's edge, one hand on the pillow, and stared mournfully ahead as she accused him of never doing anything their mother asked, never helping, always too full of himself, just like now. He insisted that he wouldn't have dreamed about their mother that way if he hadn't cared. But Sue countered that he hadn't dreamed about her at all. He had dreamed about himself. That was why he wanted to look in the diary, to see if there was anything about him in it. Through forced laughs, he asked whether she went down to the cellar, sat on that stool, and wrote about all of them in her little black book. He kept laughing, troubled, needing the noise. He put his hands on his knees, but could barely feel them. Sue watched him as if remembering rather than seeing. Then she pulled the book from under her pillow, opened it, and searched for a page. He stopped laughing and waited. She read aloud. A date in early August. 19 days dead. No one had mentioned him that day. Their father, Jack, had been in a horrible mood, hurting Tom on the stairs for making noise, scratching his head badly so that blood appeared. At lunch, they mixed 2 soup tins. Their father didn't speak to anyone. Julie talked about her bloke Derek, asked if anyone minded her bringing him home sometime. Sue said no. Their father pretended not to hear and went upstairs. She found another page and read with more expression. Their father hadn't changed clothes since the death. Didn't wash his hands or anything. Smelled horrible. They hated when he touched a loaf of bread. No one could say anything to him in case he hit someone. He was always about to hit someone, but Julie knew how to deal with him. Sue paused, seemed about to continue, then snapped the book shut and said, "There." Afterward, they argued wearily about what Julie had actually said at lunchtime. He maintained she never mentioned bringing anyone home. Sue insisted she did. Then Sue squatted on the floor by one of her books and pretended not to notice when he left. Downstairs, the radio played louder than he had ever heard. A man shouting wildly about a competition. He found Tom sitting at the top of the stairs in a blue and white frock that tied in a bow at the back, though his wig was elsewhere. As he sat beside Tom, he briefly noticed a faint, unpleasant smell. Tom was crying, knuckles pressed into his eyes like a little girl on a biscuit tin. A thick strand of green snot hung from one nostril, bobbing out of sight when he sniffed. Beyond the radio noise, he thought he caught other voices, but wasn't sure. When he asked why Tom was crying, the boy only cried louder. Then Tom recovered and whined that Julie had hit him and shouted at him, and he started crying again. He left Tom and went downstairs. The radio was blasting because Julie and Derek were in the middle of an argument. He stopped short of the kitchen door, trying to listen. Derek seemed to be pleading. His voice had a whining edge. They were both talking, nearly shouting as he walked in. They stopped immediately. Derek leaned against the table, hands in pockets, ankles crossed, wearing a dark green suit and a cravat knotted through a gold clasp. Julie stood by the window. He walked between them, switched off the radio, turned, and waited for one of them to speak. He wondered why they didn't go outside into the garden to shout at each other. Julie asked what he wanted. She wasn't dressed up. Plastic sandals, jeans, her shirt tied in a knot under her breasts. He answered that he just came down to see what all the noise was and who had hit Tom, glancing at Derek as he said it. Julie tapped her foot slowly, making clear she wanted him to leave. He walked back between them slowly, placing each heel just in front of his toes the way people do when measuring distance without a ruler. Derek cleared his throat softly, pulled out his watch by its chain, snapped it open and closed, and put it away. He hadn't seen Derek since his first visit over a week ago, though Derek had called for Julie in his car several times. He'd heard the engine outside and Julie running down the front path, but he never looked out the window at them the way Sue and Tom did. 2 or 3 times Julie had stayed out all night. She never told him where she went, but she told Sue. The morning after, the 2 of them would sit in the kitchen for hours, talking and drinking tea. He wondered whether Sue wrote it all down without Julie knowing. Suddenly, Derek smiled and asked how he was. Julie sighed noisily, telling Derek not to. He answered coolly that he was all right. Derek asked what he was up to these days. He looked at Julie as he spoke and said, "Nothing much." He could see it irritated her that he was talking to her Derek. He returned the question. Derek paused, then sighed that he was practicing. A few small games, nothing big. He nodded. Derek and Julie stared at each other. He looked from one to the other, trying to think of something else to say. Without taking his eyes off Julie, Derek asked whether he had ever played the game himself. If she hadn't been there, he would have said yes. He had watched once and knew the rules, Instead, he admitted, "Not really." Derek pulled out his watch again and suggested he should come down and have a game. Julie unfolded her arms and walked quickly out with a small sigh. Derek watched her go and asked whether he was busy now. He thought hard and said he wasn't all that busy. Derek stood, dusted his suit with his very small, pale hands, went to the hallway mirror to adjust his cravat, and called over his shoulder that he should get a light for out here. They left by the back. Passing through the kitchen, he noticed the cellar door wide open. He hesitated, wanting to go upstairs and ask Julie about it. But Derek pushed the door shut with his foot, urged him to come on because he was already late, and they hurried up the front garden path toward the low red car. He was surprised Derek drove so slowly, sitting upright, holding the wheel at arm's length between finger and thumb, as if the touch disgusted him. Derek didn't speak. 2 rows of black dials on the instrument panel each had a flickering white needle. He watched these most of the journey. None of the needles really moved, except the clock. After 15 minutes, they turned off a main road into a narrow street lined with vegetable warehouses, rotting vegetables piled in the gutter. A crumpled suited man with oily hair and a folded newspaper in his pocket stood on the pavement, staring blankly. Derek stopped the car beside him, climbed out, left the engine running, and told the man to park the car and see him inside. Behind the man lay an alleyway. At its end were green swing doors with Oswald's Hall scratched into the paint. Derek went in first and held the door open with one finger, not turning around. 2 games were being played on the farthest tables, but nearly all the tables were empty and dark. One table in the center of the hall was fully lit, brighter than the others, its colored balls set out and ready. Someone leaned against it, back turned, smoking. In the wall behind them, a bright square hole revealed an old man in a white jacket looking at them. On a narrow shelf in front of the man were blue-edged cups and saucers and a plastic bowl holding one bun. Derek stooped to speak to him. He walked a few steps toward one of the tables and read the maker's name on a brass plate screwed to the edge behind the center pocket. Derek made a clicking sound with his tongue, holding a cup of tea in each hand, and jerked his head for him to follow. With his foot, Derek pushed open a door in the same wall. Next to the door, he now noticed a window missing one pane of glass. A woman with thick glasses sat behind a desk writing in an accounts book. On the other side of the tiny room, a man sat in an armchair holding a pack of cigarettes. Smoke made it hard to see. One dim lamp sat on the desk's edge. Derek set the teacups by the lamp and pretended to punch the man on the chin. The man and woman made a great fuss over Derek, calling him son, but Derek introduced them as Mr. and Mrs. O for Oswald. Derek made a clicking sound with his tongue, teacups in both hands, and jerked his head for him to follow. Derek pushed open another door with his foot. Next to it, he now noticed a window missing one pane of glass. Inside, a woman with thick glasses sat behind a desk writing in an accounts book. Across the tiny room, a man sat in an armchair holding a packet of cigarettes. Smoke stung the air, visibility poor. A single dim lamp sat on the desk's edge. Derek set the cups down by the lamp and pretended to punch the man on the chin. The man and woman made a great fuss over Derek, calling him son, but Derek introduced them as Mr. and Mrs. O for Oswald. Then Derek added that this was Julie's brother, but didn't offer a name. There was nowhere to sit. Derek took a cigarette from Mr. O's packet. Mrs. O kicked her legs, made a whimpering sound, and lifted her mouth like a baby bird. Derek took another cigarette and placed it in her mouth. She and Mr. O laughed. Mr. O gestured toward the tables and mentioned that Greg had been out there waiting almost an hour. Derek nodded, sitting on the desk's edge. He stood by the door. Mrs. O wagged a finger in Derek's face, calling him a naughty boy. Derek shifted away, reached for his tea, and didn't pass him his own cup. Mrs. O noted that Derek hadn't come in yesterday. Mr. O winked at him and said, Derek had other fish to fry. Derek sipped his tea in silence. Mr. O added that quite a crowd had been waiting for Derek to show up. Derek nodded, said good. Mrs. O told him Derek had been coming in since he was 12, and they never charged him for a table. Derek finished his tea and stood, asking Mr. O for his cue. Mr. O put on slippers, walked to a rack of cues along the wall, one end padlocked to a long, tapering leather case. He wiped his hands on a yellow cloth, unlocked the case, and drew out a very dark brown, almost black cue. Before handing it over, Mr. O said he was the only one Derek let touch his cues. Mrs. O said, "And me?" but Mr. O smiled and shook his head. The man who had parked the car waited outside the office. Derek introduced him as Chaz, Julie's brother. He and Chaz didn't look at each other. As Derek walked slowly toward the center table with his cue, Chaz tiptoed beside him, talking quickly into his ear. He walked right behind them. He felt like leaving. Chaz was saying something about a horse, but Derek neither replied nor turned his head. As Derek neared the table, Greg bent low to aim his opening shot. Brown leather jacket with a big tear in one arm, hair tied back in a ponytail. He wanted Greg to win. The white ball drifted the table's length, dislodged one red, and returned to its start. Derek removed his jacket, handed it to Chaz, and fixed silver bands around his arms to keep his cuffs clear. Chaz turned the jacket inside out, folded it over his arm, and opened his paper to the racing page. Derek ducked and hit the white without appearing to aim. When the dislodged red smacked into the bottom pocket, players on the other two tables looked up and walked toward them. Derek's heels clicked sharply as he strode to the table's opposite end. The white had broken up all the reds and lined up with the black. Before his shot, Derek glanced up to check if he was watching. He looked away. For the next few minutes, Derek hit reds and the black into the bottom pockets. Between each shot, he walked quickly from one side of the table to the other and spoke in a quiet voice, not looking his way, as if talking to himself. Derek commented on the funny setup in his house. He said he didn't know. Derek told Chaz that both parents were dead and the four of them were looking after themselves. Chaz muttered orphans, not looking up from his paper. Derek said it was a big house. He agreed. Pretty big. Derek remarked it must be worth quite a bit, then added, as a red disappeared over a pocket's lip, that with all those rooms he could turn it into flats. He said they weren't thinking of that. Derek watched Greg pick the black from the pocket and spot it. Derek added that not many houses had a cellar like that. Another red went down. Derek said he could do something with that cellar. He asked what, but Derek only shrugged and hammered the black into the pocket. When Derek finally missed the black, he made a sharp hissing sound between his teeth. Chaz looked from his paper and announced 49. He said he was going now, but Derek had turned away to get a cigarette from another player, then walked to the table's far end to watch Greg. He felt sick. He leaned back against a pillar and looked up at the ceiling. Iron girders, and beyond them, panes of glass smeared with yellowish-brown paint. He looked down. Derek was playing again, with only a few balls left. When the game ended, Derek came up from behind and gripped his elbow, asking if he wanted a game. He said no, and pulled away. He said he was going back home now. Derek stood in front of him and laughed, resting the thick end of his cue against his foot and jigging it up and down. Derek called him a queer one, asked why he didn't relax a bit, why he never smiled. He leaned back against the pillar. Something heavy and dark pressed down on him. He stared up at the ceiling again, half expecting to see it. Derek kept jigging his cue, then had an idea. He drew in his breath sharply and called over his shoulder for Chaz and Greg to come and help make this miserable bugger laugh. Derek smiled and winked as if he should be in on the joke. Chaz and Greg appeared on either side of Derek and slightly behind him. Derek urged a big laugh, or he'd tell his sister. Their faces grew larger, Derek added, or he'd make Greg tell one of his jokes. Chaz and Greg laughed. Everyone wanted to be on Derek's right side. He told them to fuck off. Chaz said to leave the lad alone and walked away. The way Chaz said it made him want to cry, so to prove that was the last thing he'd do, he stared at Derek fiercely without blinking. But water collected in one eye. He snatched at the tear as soon as it rolled out, but he knew they had seen it. Greg held out his hand, saying no harm meant, old mate. He didn't shake it because his hand was wet. Greg walked off, leaving just him and Derek. He turned and walked toward the door. Derek left his cue on a table and came with him, walking so close they could have been handcuffed. Derek said he was really just like his sister. Because he couldn't get past Derek, he had to head left of the door toward the tea hatch. The old man there saw them coming, took up his big steel teapot, and filled 2 cups in a very high-pitched voice, saying they could have these ones on him for the 49 points. Said it to him as much as to Derek. He had to pick up a cup. Derek picked up his too, and they leaned against the wall facing each other. For several minutes, Derek seemed about to speak, but remained silent. He tried to drink quickly, which made him feel hot and sick. Under his shirt, his skin prickled and itched. His feet sweated, his toes slippery against one another. He leaned his head against the wall. Greg had gone with Chas through another door. The other players were back at their tables. Through the wall, he heard Mrs. O talking uninterruptedly. After a while, he thought it might be the radio. Derek asked whether his sister was always like this, or if something was wrong that he should know about. He asked immediately what Derek meant. Always like what? His heart thudded, very slowly. Derek stretched the skin under his chin and touched his cravat, then said this was strictly man-to-man. He nodded. Derek explained, "Take this afternoon. She was doing something, so he thought he'd take a look around the cellar. No harm in that, but she got very funny about it. There was nothing down there, was there?" He didn't think it was a real question and made no reply, but Derek repeated the question. He answered no. He hardly ever went down there, but there was nothing. Derek pressed him. So why should she get so upset? He told Derek she was always like that. That was what Julie was like. Derek looked down at his shoes for a moment, looked up, and started to say, "And another time." But Mr. O came out of his office just then and started talking to Derek. He finished his tea and left. At home, the back door was open. He went in very quietly. The kitchen smelled of something fried long ago. He had a strange sensation of having been away for months, that many things had happened in his absence. In the living room, Julie sat by the table, dirty plates, and a frying pan on it. She looked very pleased with herself. Tom sat on her lap, thumb in his mouth, a napkin tied around his neck like a bib. He stared across the room in a glazed way, his head leaning against Julie's breasts. He didn't seem to notice anyone had come in and kept making small sucking noises with his thumb. Julie rested one hand on the small of his back. She smiled at him. He put his hand on the doorknob to steady himself, feeling weightless, as if he might drift away. Julie told him not to be so surprised. Tom wanted to be a little baby. She rested her chin on Tom's head and began to rock slightly, adding that he had been such a naughty boy that afternoon. So they had a long talk and decided lots of things, speaking more to Tom than to him. Tom's eyes were closing. He sat at the table close to Julie, but where he couldn't see Tom's face. He picked at the cold pieces of bacon in the frying pan. Julie rocked and hummed quietly to herself. Tom was asleep. He had meant to talk to Julie about Derek, but she stood with Tom in her arms, and he followed them upstairs. Julie pushed open the bedroom door with her foot. She had brought up the old brass cot from the cellar and placed it right beside her own bed, all made up with one side down. He was annoyed to see them so close, and asked why she hadn't put it in Tom's own room. Julie, her back to him, was setting Tom down. Tom sat swaying as she unbuttoned his dress, his eyes open. She answered that he wanted it in here. Tom nodded as he crawled between the sheets. Julie drew the curtains, and he advanced into the semi-darkness to stand at the cot's foot. She pushed past him, kissed Tom's head, and carefully raised the side. Tom seemed asleep almost instantly. She whispered that he was a good boy, took his hand, and led him out. Not long after Sue read to him from her diary, he began noticing a smell on his hands, sweet and faintly rotten, more on the fingers than the palms, or perhaps even between them. It reminded him of meat they had thrown out. He stopped masturbating. He didn't feel like it anyway. After washing, his hands smelled only of soap. But if he turned his head away and moved a hand quickly before his nose, the bad smell lingered beneath the perfume. He took long baths in the mid-afternoon, lying perfectly still without a thought until the water turned cold. He cut his nails, washed his hair, found clean clothes. Within half an hour the smell returned, so faint it was more like a memory. Julie and Sue made jokes about his appearance, saying he was dressing up for a secret girlfriend. Yet his new look made Julie friendlier. She bought him 2 nearly new, well-fitting shirts from a jumble sale. He confronted Tom and wiggled his fingers under the boy's nose. Tom said it was like a fishy in his loud new baby voice. He found the home medical encyclopedia and looked up cancer, thinking he might be rotting from a slow disease. He looked in the mirror and tried to catch his breath in his cupped hands. One evening, it finally rained heavily. Someone had once told him rain was the cleanest water in the world, so he took off his shirt, shoes, and socks and stood on top of the rockery with his hands stretched out. Sue came to the kitchen door and shouted over the rain, asking what he was doing. She went away and returned with Julie. They called to him and laughed. He turned his back on them. At supper, they argued. He claimed it was the first rain since their mother died. Julie and Sue said it had rained several times. When he asked exactly when, they said they couldn't remember. Sue knew she had used her umbrella because it was now in her bedroom. Julie remembered the sound of windshield wipers in Derek's car. He said that proved nothing. They became angry, which made him feel calm and intent on making them angrier. Julie challenged him to prove it hadn't rained. He said he didn't need to. He knew it hadn't. His sisters gasped with annoyance. When he asked Sue to pass the sugar bowl, she ignored him. He walked around the table, and just as he reached for it, she picked up the bowl and placed it on the other side near where he had been sitting. He moved to smack her hard on the back of the neck, but Julie cried out, "You dare!" so sharply that he drew back startled, his hand sweeping over Sue's head. Immediately, he caught the smell again. As he sat down, he waited for Julie or Sue to accuse him of farting, but they began a conversation designed to exclude him. He sat on his hands and winked at Tom. Tom stared with his mouth half open, chewed food visible on his tongue, sitting close to Julie's side. During the rain argument, he had smeared food over his face. Now he waited for Julie to remember him, wipe his face with a bib around his neck, and tell him he could leave the table. Then he might crawl underneath and sit among their legs while they finished eating. Other times he tore his bib off and ran outside to play with his friends, refusing to be a baby again until he came back inside and found Julie. As a baby, he rarely spoke or made noise. He simply waited for her next move. When she babied him, his eyes grew larger and farther apart. His mouth slackened, and he seemed to sink inside himself. One evening, as Julie picked Tom up to take him upstairs, he said that real babies kicked and screamed when put to bed. Tom glared at him over Julie's shoulder, his eyes and mouth narrowing suddenly. Tom answered reasonably that, no, they didn't, not always, and let himself be carried out. He couldn't resist watching them together. He trailed after them, fascinated, waiting to see what would happen. Julie seemed to enjoy an audience and made jokes about it, once saying he looked so serious, like he was watching a funeral. Tom, of course, wanted Julie all to himself. The second evening, he followed them upstairs again at bedtime and leaned in the doorway while Julie undressed Tom, who had his back to him. Julie smiled and asked him to bring Tom's pajamas. Tom turned in the cot and shouted for him to go away. Julie laughed, ruffled Tom's hair, and wondered aloud what she was going to do with the two of them. But he stepped backward out of her room and leaned against the corridor wall, listening while Julie read a story. When she came out at last, she wasn't surprised to see him there. They went into his room and sat on the bed without turning on the light. He cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps it was bad for Tom to go on pretending to be a baby. Maybe he wouldn't be able to come out of it. Julie didn't reply at first. He could just make out that she was smiling at him. She put her hand on his knee and said she thought someone was jealous. They laughed, and he lay back on the bed. Daringly, he touched the small of her back with his fingertips. She shivered and increased the pressure on his knee. Then Julie asked if he thought a lot about their mother. He whispered yes, and asked if she did. Of course, she said. There seemed nothing more to say, but he wanted them to go on talking. He asked whether she thought what they did was right. Julie took her hand from his knee and was silent, so long he thought she had forgotten the question. He touched her back again, and immediately she spoke. It had seemed obvious then, but she didn't know now. Perhaps they shouldn't have. He said they couldn't do anything about it now and waited for her to disagree. He also waited for her hand to return to his knee. He ran his forefinger the length of her spine and wondered what had changed between them. Had his taking baths made such a difference to her? Finally, she said no, she supposed not, and folded her arms with a finality that suggested she was offended. One moment she was in charge, the next she was silent, waiting to be attacked. He said impatiently that she had let Derek into the cellar. Now, everything changed between them. Julie crossed the room, turned on the light, and stood by the door, tossing her head irritably to clear a strand of hair from her face. He sat on the bed's edge and put his hand on his knee, where hers had been. She asked if that was what Derek told him when they were playing billiards. He said he only watched. Julie explained that Derek had found the key and gone down there to look around. He said she should have stopped him. She shook her head. It was unusual for her to plead, and her voice sounded unfamiliar. She said Derek just took the key. There was nothing to see down there. He told her she had gotten really angry about it, and now Derek wanted to know why. For once, he was getting the better of Julie in an argument. He started beating a rhythm with his hands on his knees, and briefly caught that sweet, rotten smell again. Suddenly, Julie said she hadn't slept with Derek or anything like that. He kept drumming, not looking up. Then, exultant, he stopped and asked, "So what?" But Julie had already left the room. Leaning across the table, he caught hold of Tom's bib and pulled the boy toward him. Tom whimpered, then screamed. Julie broke off her conversation and tried to pry his fingers loose. Sue stood up. Julie shouted at him, demanding to know what he was doing and to let go. He had pulled Tom a good way along the table before releasing him. Tom fell back into Julie's arms. He explained that he was going to wipe Tom's mouth for him, seeing as she was so busy talking. Tom hid his face in Julie's lap and began to cry, a good imitation of a baby's wail. Sue cried out, asking why he couldn't leave people alone and what was wrong with him. He wandered into the garden. The rain was stopping. The tower blocks looked ugly with fresh stains, but the weeds beyond the garden already seemed greener. He walked around the garden the way their father had always wanted everyone to go, along the tiny paths, down the steps to the pond. The steps were hard to find under weeds and thistles. The pond was a curled piece of dirty blue plastic with a little rainwater collected at the bottom. As he walked around it, something soft collapsed under his foot. He had trodden on a frog. It lay on its side, one long back leg stuck in the air, quivering in small circles. A creamy green substance spilled from its stomach. The sac under its chin blew in and out rapidly. With one bulging eye, it stared up at him in a sorrowful, unaccusing way. He knelt and picked up a large flat stone. The frog seemed to look at him expecting help. He waited, hoping it would recover or die suddenly. But the air sac filled and emptied faster. The frog attempted hopelessly to use its other leg to right itself. Its small front legs made swimming motions in the air. The yellowish eye stared into his. He said aloud that was enough, and brought the flat stone down sharply on the small green head. When he lifted the stone, the frog's body stuck to it, then dropped to the ground. He began to cry. He found another stone and dug a short, deep trench. As he pushed the frog in with the stick, he saw its front legs tremble. He covered it quickly with earth and stamped the grave flat. Footsteps behind him. Derek's voice asked, what was wrong with him? Derek stood with legs apart, a white raincoat slung over his shoulder, held by one finger. He said nothing was wrong. Derek came closer and asked what he had in the ground. He said nothing. Derek prodded the earth with the wedge-shaped tip of his polished boot. He admitted it was a dead frog he had just buried. But Derek kept digging until he turned over the dirt-caked body and announced it wasn't dead at all. Derek sank and twisted his heel into the frog, covering it again, all with one foot, never taking the raincoat from his shoulder. Derek smelled of perfume, some kind of cologne or aftershave. He walked farther up the garden toward the path, winding around the rockery. Derek followed right behind him. They spiraled up, passing each other in tight circles, like children in a game. Derek asked if Julie was in. He said she was putting Tom to bed, then added, when they were balancing very close at the top, that Tom now slept in her bedroom. Derek nodded quickly, as if he already knew, and squeezed his tie knot. They stared at the house, so close that when Derek spoke, he smelled peppermint on his breath. Derek called Tom odd, mentioning the girls' dresses, and smiled as if expecting him to smile back. But he folded his arms and asked what was odd about that. Derek climbed off the rockery using the paths as steps. At the bottom, he spent time folding his raincoat over his arm, then coughed and said it could affect Tom later in life. He climbed down too and asked what Derek meant by that. They stood outside the kitchen door. Derek stared through the window without replying. The living room door was open. Sue sat inside alone, reading a magazine. Suddenly, Derek asked exactly when his parents had died. He muttered a long time ago and pushed open the kitchen door. Derek caught his arm, saying Julie had told him it was recently. Sue called his name from the living room. He pulled his arm free and went indoors. Derek whispered after him to come back. Then he heard Derek carefully wiping his feet before stepping into the kitchen. As soon as Derek entered the room, Sue dropped her magazine and ran to the kitchen to make him tea. She treated him like a film star. Derek walked about with his coat folded in a neat square, looking for a place to set it down. Sue watched from the doorway like a frightened rabbit. He sat down and looked at Sue's magazine. Derek set his coat on the floor by a chair and sat too. Sue called from the kitchen that Julie was upstairs with Tom, her voice shaky. Derek called back that he would wait down here, then crossed his legs and plucked at his shirt cuffs until they protruded the right distance. He turned magazine pages without taking anything in. When Derek took the cup from Sue, he thanked her in a funny voice. She giggled and sat as far from him as possible. While stirring his tea, Derek looked straight at him and asked if he had noticed a funny smell in here. He shook his head, but felt himself blushing. Derek watched him and sipped, then lifted his head and sniffed loudly, calling it not strong, but very odd. Sue stood and spoke rapidly about the drain outside the kitchen. It got blocked easily, and in the summer, she repeated that it was the drain. Derek nodded while she talked, looking at him. Sue went back to her chair. For a long time, no one spoke. None of them heard Julie enter. When she spoke softly, Derek started. He stood up straight like a soldier and greeted her very politely. Sue giggled. Julie wore her velvet skirt, her hair tied back with a white ribbon. Derek said they had been talking about the drains and tried with a stiff hand motion to direct Julie into his chair. Instead, she settled on the arm of his chair. She repeated the word drains as if to herself, but showed no curiosity. Derek asked how she had been. Sue giggled again. They all turned to look at her. Julie pointed at Derek's coat and asked why he didn't hang it up before someone trod on it. Derek lifted the coat onto his lap and stroked it, saying, "Nice pussy." No one laughed. Sue asked if Tom was asleep. Julie said he was out like a light. Derek took out his watch and looked at it. They all knew what he was going to say. He commented that it seemed a bit early for Tom. Sue had a fit of giggling, clasping her hands over her face, and hobbled into the kitchen. They heard her open the door and go outside. Julie remained very cool, stating that in fact it was later than usual and asking for confirmation. He nodded, though he had no idea what time it was. Julie ruffled his hair and asked Derek if he hadn't noticed a difference. Derek answered instantly, cleaner and smarter, then asked if he was pulling the ladies now. Julie rested her hand on his head and said, "They were having none of that around here." Derek laughed and took out his cigarettes. When he offered one to Julie, she refused. He kept very still, not wanting her to move her hand, yet sensed he looked foolish to Derek. Derek settled back, smoking and watching them. They heard Sue open the back door, but she stayed in the kitchen. Suddenly, Derek smiled. He wondered whether Julie was smiling too behind him. They stood at the same time without speaking. Before taking her hand off his head, Julie gave it a little pat. As soon as they were upstairs, Sue returned and sat on the edge of Derek's chair. She laughed nervously and announced she knew what that smell was, adding that it wasn't her. She led him into the kitchen and unlocked the cellar door. He knew at once. The same smell, but intensified, now separate from him. Something sweet, and beyond that or wrapped around it, Another bigger, softer smell, like a fat finger pushing into the back of his throat, rolling up the concrete steps out of the darkness. He breathed through his mouth. Sue urged him to go down, said he knew what it was, turned on the light and pushed him in the small of the back. He said only if she came too. A rustling sound came from somewhere along the corridor at the bottom, leading to the end room. Sue stepped back into the kitchen and picked up Tom's plastic toy torch, shaped like a fish. Its light came from its mouth, very weak. He said there was plenty of light. They didn't need that. But she prodded him in the back with it and whispered for him to go on. He would see. At the foot of the stairs, they stopped to turn on another set of lights. Sue covered her nose with a handkerchief. He pulled his shirt tails over his face. The door at the corridor's end stood half open. From inside came that rustling sound again. Sue said it was rats. When they reached the door, the room fell suddenly silent. He stopped. Sue urged him to push through her handkerchief. He didn't move, but the door began opening on its own. He cried out and stepped back, then saw that Sue was pressing with her foot near the hinge. The trunk looked as if it had been kicked. Its middle bulged outward. The concrete surface was broken by a huge crack, in places half an inch wide. Sue wanted him to look down it. She put the toy torch in his hand, pointed, and said something he couldn't hear. As he shone the light along the crack, he remembered a scene. Commander Hunt's crew flying low across an unknown planet's surface. Thousands of miles of flat, hard-baked desert broken only by earthquake fissures. No hills or trees or houses or water. No wind because no air. They flew away into space without landing, and no one spoke for hours. Sue uncovered her mouth and whispered fiercely, asking what he was waiting for. He leaned over the crack at its widest point and shone the torch down. He saw a convoluted yellowish-gray surface. Around the edge, something black and frayed. As he stared, the surface briefly formed itself into a face, an eye, part of a nose, a dark mouth. Then the image dissolved back into convoluted surfaces. He thought he was about to fall and handed the torch to Sue. But the feeling passed as he watched her bend over the trunk. They went into the corridor and closed the door behind them. Sue asked if he had seen, the sheet all torn, her nightie visible underneath. For a moment, they were very excited, as if discovering their mother was still alive. They had seen her in her nightie, just the way she was. Going up the stairs, he said the smell wasn't too bad once you got used to it. Sue half laughed, half sobbed, and dropped the torch. Behind them, the rats started up again. She took deep breaths, bent to pick up the torch, and as she straightened, said they would have to get more cement, her voice quite level. At the top of the stairs, they met Derek. Over Derek's shoulder, he could see Julie in the center of the kitchen. Derek blocked their way out of the cellar and commented in a friendly way that they weren't very good at keeping secrets, then asked what they had down there that smelled so good. They pushed past without replying. Sue stood at the sink and drank water from a teacup. The sound of liquid going down her throat was very loud. He said it was none of Derek's business, really. He turned to Julie, hoping she would think of something to say. She walked to where Derek stood in the cellar doorway and tried to pull him gently by the arm, suggesting they lock the door because that smell was getting on her nerves. But Derek pulled his arm away and repeated, still friendly, that they hadn't told him what it was yet. He brushed the arm of his jacket where Julie had pulled and smiled, saying he was very curious. They watched him turn and descend the stairs, heard his footsteps stop at the bottom as he fumbled for the light switch, then continued to the room at the end, and then they followed him down. First Julie, then Sue, then him. Derek took a pale blue handkerchief from his breast pocket, shook it out, and held it near his face rather than over it. He was determined to use nothing and took quick breaths between his teeth. Derek tapped the trunk with his boot, his sister's, and he stood in a shallow circle behind Derek, as if some important ceremony were about to take place. Derek traced the crack with his finger and peered inside, commenting that whatever was in there was really rotten. Julie suddenly and simply said it was a dead dog. Jack's dog. Derek grinned. He said she had promised not to tell. Julie shrugged and said it didn't matter now. Derek bent over the trunk. Julie continued. It was his idea of a tomb. He had put the dog in there when it died and poured concrete all over her. Derek broke off a piece of concrete and tossed it in his hand, remarking that he hadn't made a very good job of the mix and that the trunk wasn't holding the weight. Julie told him the smell was all over the house and he'd better do something about it. Derek wiped his hands carefully on his handkerchief and suggested a reburial in the garden, perhaps next to his frog. He went over to the trunk and kicked it gently the way Derek had done, then said firmly that he didn't want it moved, not after all that work. Derek led the way out of the cellar. Upstairs, they all went into the living room. Derek asked the name of his dog. Without thinking, he said Cosmo. Derek came and put a hand on his shoulder, saying they would have to seal that crack with cement and hope the trunk would hold. For the rest of the evening, they sat about doing nothing. Derek talked about snooker. Much later, as he was going to his bedroom, Derek said he would show him how to make a proper mix this time. From the stairs, he heard Julie say it was best to leave him to it. He didn't like being shown what to do. Derek said something he couldn't hear, then laughed to himself for rather a long time. The hot weather returned. In the morning, Julie sunbathed on the rockery, this time without her radio. Tom, wearing his own clothes for the first time in days, played in the garden with his friend from the tower block. Whenever Tom was about to do something he considered particularly daring, like jumping over a stone, he wanted Julie to watch him. His voice carried all morning. He watched them from the kitchen. Julie lay on a bright blue towel and ignored Tom. Her skin was so dark he thought it would only be another day before it turned black. Several wasps fed off rubbish spilled across the kitchen floor. Outside, a cloud of flies circled the overflowing dustbins that hadn't been emptied for weeks. They thought there might be a strike, but had heard nothing. A packet of butter had melted into a pool. While he watched out the window, he dabbed his finger in it and sucked. Today, it was too hot to clean. Sue came and told him it was already a record. She had heard on the radio that it was the hottest day since 1900. Sue said Julie should be careful and went outside to warn her. But neither Tom and his friend nor Julie seemed touched by the heat. Julie lay still. The boys chased each other around the garden, shouting each other's names. In the late afternoon, he walked to the shops with Julie to buy a packet of cement. Tom came too, keeping close to Julie's side and holding onto a corner of her white skirt. At one point, he had to stand in the shade of a bus shelter to recover from the heat. Julie stood in front of him in the sunlight, trying to fan him with her hand, asking what was the matter with him. He looked so weak. What had he been doing with himself? She caught his eye and they both laughed. Outside the shop, they saw their reflections in the plate glass window. Julie locked her hand into his and commented on how pale his were. He pulled his hand away. As they went into the shop, she spoke to him firmly as if he were a child, saying he really ought to get out in the sun. It would do him good. On the way home, he thought of a time not long ago when Julie had never spoken unless spoken to. Now she talked excitedly to Tom about circuses, and once she stopped and knelt by him, using a paper tissue to wipe his lips clean of ice cream and snot. When they arrived at the front gate, he decided he did not want to go back indoors. Julie took the 10-pound bag of cement from him and agreed. That's right, he should stay out in the sun. As he walked up his street, he noticed suddenly how different it looked. Hardly a street at all, more a road across an almost empty junkyard. Only 2 other houses still stood apart from his. Ahead, a group of workmen gathered around a builder's lorry, preparing to go home. The lorry started up just as he reached it. 3 men stood on the back, holding onto the rack above the driver's cab. One saw him and jerked his head sideways in greeting. Then, as the lorry bounced over the curb, the man pointed toward his house and shrugged. All that remained of the prefabs were the big foundation slabs. He went and stood on one. Grooves ran across the slab where the walls had been. Weeds like small lettuces grew in them. He walked along the wall lines, placing one foot just in front of the other, and thought, how strange that a whole family could live inside this rectangle of concrete. Hard to tell now whether this was the prefab he had visited before. Nothing distinguished them. He took off his shirt, spread it on the floor in the center of the largest room, lay on his back, and stretched his hands out so his fingers caught the sun. Immediately the heat stifled him. His skin prickled with sweat, but determined he stayed and daydreamed. When he woke, He wondered why he wasn't in his bed. He shivered and felt for his sheets. Standing up, his head began to ache. He picked up his shirt and walked home slowly, stopping once to admire the blood-red color of his chest and arms, deepened by the evening sunlight. Derek's car was parked outside. Entering the kitchen, he saw the cellar door open and heard voices and scraping noises. Derek had rolled up his sleeves and was forcing wet cement down the crack with a trowel. Julie stood watching, hands on her hips. Derek said he was doing his chores for him, but obviously enjoyed himself. Julie seemed delighted to see him, as if he had been away at sea for years, exclaiming at his sunburn, calling him lovely, and asking Derek if he didn't agree. Derek grunted and leaned over his work. Already the smell was less noticeable. Derek whistled softly as he smoothed the cement. With Derek's back turned, Julie winked at him. He pretended he was about to kick Derek in the backside. Sensing something, Derek asked, without turning, if anything was wrong. They answered together that nothing was wrong and began to laugh. Derek came toward him with the trowel, sounding hurt as he suggested perhaps he better do it. He said no. Derek was much better at it. Derek tried to put the trowel into his hands, saying it was his dog. If it was a dog. Julie soothingly called Derek's name and asked him to please do it, reminding him he said he would, leading him back to the trunk. She added that if he did it, it would only crack again, and the smell would be everywhere. Derek shrugged and resumed his work. Julie patted his shoulder, picked up his jacket from a nail, folded it over her arm, patted that too, and whispered, "Nice pussy." Derek ignored their soft giggles. He finished the job and stood back. Julie congratulated him. Derek made her a little bow and tried to hold her hand. He said something similar, but Derek didn't look his way. Upstairs in the kitchen, they stood in attendance while Derek washed his hands. Julie offered him a towel. As he dried his hands, he tried to draw her toward him, but Julie came and put her hand on his shoulder instead, admiring the color in his face, saying he looked so much better, and asking Derek if he didn't agree. Derek was knotting his tie with quick, sharp movements. Julie appeared to have complete control of his moods. Derek adjusted his cuffs, reached for his jacket, and commented that it looked to him like he had overdone it. He moved toward the door. For a moment he thought Derek was going to leave. Instead, Derek stooped, picked up an old tea bag by its corner, and threw it toward the waste bin. Julie filled the kettle. He wandered into the living room to look for teacups. When the tea was finally ready, they drank standing up in the kitchen. Back in his suit with his tie on, Derek was more like his old self, very erect, holding cup in one hand and saucer in the other. Derek asked him questions about school and jobs, then carefully remarked that he must have been very attached to that dog. He nodded and waited for Julie to change the subject. Derek asked when it died. He said it was a she. Derek, a little sulkily, rephrased, "When did she die?" "About 2 months ago." Derek turned to Julie and looked at her pleadingly. She smiled and filled his cup. Derek spoke into the space between them, asking what kind of dog. Julie said a mixture of things. He added mostly Labrador, and briefly, from somewhere, a dog seemed to lift its sunken eyes to his. He shook his head. Derek asked if he minded talking about it. He said no. Derek asked what gave him the idea of putting her down there. He said sort of like preserving her, like the Egyptians. Derek nodded curtly, as if everything was explained. Just then, Tom ran in, clung to Julie's leg. They shifted positions to widen the circle. Derek tried to touch Tom's head, but Tom pushed his hand away, spilling some tea on the floor. Derek stared at the splashes a moment and asked Tom if he liked Cosmo. Still holding Julie's leg, Tom leaned backward to look at Derek and laughed, as if this were a running joke. Julie rapidly reminded Tom about Cosmo, their dog. Tom nodded. Derek asked if Tom was sad when she died. Tom swung back and stared up at Julie. She asked if he remembered sitting on her lap and crying. Tom said yes, mischievously, then asked her if he cried. Julie confirmed that was right and reminded him she carried him to bed. Tom leaned his head against Julie's belly, seeming deep in reflection. Anxious to get Tom away from Derek, Julie set down her cup and led him into the garden. As they went through the door, Tom loudly said, "A dog!" and laughed derisively. Derek rattled his car keys. Through the window, they watched Julie race Tom across the garden. She looked so beautiful, turning to encourage Tom, that it irritated him to share the sight with Derek. Without turning from the window, Derek said wistfully that he wished they would all trust him a little more. He yawned. He, Sue, and Julie hadn't discussed their dog story together. They hadn't been careful with Derek. Often, what was in the cellar didn't feel real enough to keep secret. When not actually down there looking at the trunk, it was as if they were asleep. Derek took out his watch, said he had a game, and added perhaps he'd see them later tonight. He stepped outside and called to Julie, who paused only briefly in her game with Tom to wave and blow a kiss. Derek waited a moment before walking away, but her back was already turned. He went to his bedroom, took off his shoes and socks, and lay down. Through his window, he saw a clear square of pale blue sky, not one cloud. After less than a minute, he sat up and stared around. On the floor, Coca-Cola tins, dirty clothes, fish and chip wrappers, several wire coat hangers, a box that once held rubber bands. He stood and looked at where he had been lying, the folds and rucks in the yellowish-gray sheets, large stains with distinct edges. He felt stifled. Everything he looked at reminded him of himself. He opened his wardrobe doors wide and threw in all the debris from the floor. He pulled the sheets, blankets, and pillows off his bed and put those in too. He ripped down pictures he had once cut for magazines. Under the bed he found plates and cups covered in green mold. He took every loose object and put it in the wardrobe until the room was bare. He even took down the light bulb and shade. Then he took off his clothes, threw them in, and closed the doors. The room was empty like a cell. He lay down on the bed again and stared at his patch of clear sky until he fell asleep. It was dark and cold when he woke. With eyes closed, he felt for the bedclothes. He had a confused memory of lying in the prefab. Was he still there? He had no idea how he came to be lying naked on a bare mattress. Someone was crying. Was it him? He knelt to close the window and suddenly remembered that his mother had died a long time ago. At once, everything fell into place. He lay down shivering and listened. The crying was soft and continuous, like a moan, coming from the next room. It was soothing. For a while he listened only to the sound, without curiosity beyond that. He stopped shivering and closed his eyes, and immediately, as if a show had been delayed until he settled down, he saw a set of vivid pictures. He opened his eyes briefly and saw the same images imposed on the darkness. He wondered why he needed to sleep so much. He saw a crowded beach on a very hot afternoon. Time to go home. His mother and father walked ahead carrying deck chairs and a bundle of towels. He couldn't keep up. Large round pebbles hurt his feet. In his hand, a stick with a windmill on the end. He was crying because he was tired and wanted to be carried. His parents stopped to wait, but when he came within a few feet, they turned and went on. His crying became a long wail. Other children stopped to stare. He let go of the windmill. Someone picked it up and offered it back. He shook his head and wailed louder. His mother gave her deck chair to his father and walked toward him. When she picked him up, he found himself looking backward over her shoulder at a girl who held his windmill and stared at him. The breeze turned the bright sails. He desperately wanted it back, but already she was far behind. Now they were on the pavement, his mother's stride rhythmic. He kept crying to himself, but his mother did not seem to hear. This time he opened his eyes and woke completely. With the windows closed, his small room was hot and airless. Next door, Tom was still crying. He stood up and fell dizzily against the wardrobe. Opening it, he felt for his clothes. The light bulb rolled out and broke on the floor. He swore in a loud whisper. Too stifled by both darkness and lack of air to keep searching, he walked toward the door with hands stretched out and face screwed up. On the landing, he waited for his eyes to adjust. Downstairs, Julie and Sue were talking. At the sound of his door opening, Tom had gone silent, but now he started again. A forced, unconvincing crying Julie would ignore. Her bedroom door was open. He went in quietly. The room was lit by a very weak bulb. Tom didn't notice him at first. He had kicked the blankets and sheets to the bottom of the cot and lay on his back naked, looking at the ceiling. The sound he made was like dull singing. Sometimes he seemed to forget the crying altogether and fell silent. Then he remembered and began again louder. For 5 minutes or so he stood behind Tom listening. One arm was flung behind Tom's head. With the other hand, Tom played with himself, pulling and rolling between finger and thumb. He said, "Watcha." Tom tilted his head back and looked at him without surprise, then returned his gaze to the ceiling and resumed crying. He leaned over the cot side and asked roughly what was wrong with him, why he didn't shut up. Tom's crying became the real clucking kind. Tears spilled onto the sheet. He told Tom to wait and tried to lower the cot side. In the gloom, he couldn't see how to release the catch. Tom drew a huge breath and screamed. Difficult to concentrate. He banged at the catch with his fist, took hold of the vertical bars, and shook them until the whole cot rocked. Tom started to laugh. Something gave. The side dropped away. In his baby voice, Tom demanded he do that again. He sat at one end of the cot on the pile of sheets. They stared at each other. Presently, Tom asked in his ordinary voice why he didn't have any clothes on. He said because he was hot. Tom nodded, said he was hot too, and lay back with arms folded behind his head, more like a sunbather than an infant. He asked if that was why Tom was crying, because he was hot. Tom thought a moment, then nodded. He said crying makes you hotter. Tom admitted he wanted Julie to come up. She said she would. He asked why Tom wanted her to come up. Tom said because he wanted her to. When he pressed further, Tom clicked his tongue in exasperation and said because he wanted her. He folded his arms, in the mood for interrogation. He asked if Tom remembered their mother. Tom opened his mouth slightly and nodded. He asked if Tom didn't want her instead. Tom said indignantly that she was dead. He settled into the cot. Tom moved over to make room for his legs. He said that even though she was dead, didn't Tom wish she would come up and see him instead of Julie? Tom boasted that he had been in her room and knew where Julie kept the key. Her locked bedroom hardly ever entered his mind. When he thought of Mother, he thought of the cellar. He asked what Tom did in there. Tom said nothing. He asked what was in there. Tom's voice had a slight whine as he said Julie had put everything away. All Mum's things. He asked what Tom wanted with Mum's things. Tom stared as if the question had no meaning. He asked if Tom played with her things. Tom nodded and pursed his lips in imitation of Julie, saying they did dressing up and things. He asked if Tom and Julie did that. Tom giggled and called him stupid. It was him and Michael, his friend from the tower blocks. He asked if Tom dressed up in Mum's clothes. Tom explained that sometimes they were Mummy and Daddy, sometimes Julie and him, and sometimes Julie and Derek. He asked what Tom did when they were him and Julie. Tom said vaguely, "Just play." Because of the light on his face, and because he had secrets, Tom seemed like a tiny, wise old man lying at his feet. He wondered if Tom believed in heaven. He asked if Tom knew where Mum was now. Tom stared at the ceiling and said in the cellar, "In that trunk under all that stuff," he whispered, asking who told him that. Tom said Derek did. Derek said he put her in there. Tom turned on his side and put his thumb near his mouth. He shook Tom's ankle, asking when Derek told him that. Tom shook his head. He never knew if something happened yesterday or last week. He asked what else Derek said. Tom sat up, grinned, and said, "Derek said he keeps pretending it's a dog." Tom laughed, repeating, "A dog?" Tom covered himself with one corner of the sheet and rolled on his side again, thumb tipped between his lips, but eyes still open. He arranged a pillow behind his back. He liked it here in Tom's bed. Everything he had just heard didn't matter to him. He felt like raising the cot side and sitting all night. The last time he had slept here, everything had been watched over and arranged. When he was 4, he had believed his mother devised his dreams at night. If she asked in the morning what he had dreamed, it was to hear if he could tell the truth. He had given up the cot to Sue long before that, when he was 2, but lying in it now felt familiar. Its salty, clammy smell, the arrangement of bars, an enveloping pleasure in being tenderly imprisoned. A long time passed. Tom's eyes opened briefly and closed again. He sucked his thumb deeper into his mouth. He didn't want Tom to fall asleep yet. He whispered Tom's name and asked why Tom wanted to be a baby. Tom whined thinly that he was squashing him, kicked feebly from under the sheet, said it was his bed. His voice failed, and his eyes closed firmly as his breathing settled into a deep rhythm. He watched for a minute until a faint sound made him aware he too was being watched from the doorway. Julie whispered to herself, telling them to look at this. Just look at him. She crossed the room, punched his shoulder, and put her hand over her mouth to stifle laughter. She called them two bear babies, lifted and secured the side, leaned her elbows over the cot, and smiled in delight. Her hair was up, fine strands curled down by her ears, which held earrings of brightly colored glass beads. She called him a sweet little thing and stroked his head. Her white cotton blouse was unbuttoned down to the swell of her breasts. Her skin was a deep, dull brown. She pursed her lips, but her smile kept pulling them apart. The sweet, sharp smell of her perfume wrapped around him. He sat grinning foolishly, staring into her eyes. As a joke, he thought of putting his thumb in his mouth and lifted his hand to his face. She encouraged him not to be afraid. The flat taste of his own skin brought him back to himself. He said he was getting out. As he knelt up, Julie pointed through the bars, laughed and said, "Look, it's big," and made as if to grab him. He climbed over the side. While Julie covered Tom with a blanket, he edged toward the door, already regretting ending their scene. Julie caught his arm and steered him toward the bed, asking him not to go away yet. She wanted to talk. They sat facing each other. Her eyes were wild and bright. She told him he looked lovely without his clothes, pink and white like an ice cream, and touched his sunburned arm, asking if it was sore. He shook his head and asked what about her clothes. She undressed briskly. When her clothes were in a small pile on the bed, she nodded toward Tom and asked what he thought of him. Didn't he think Tom was happy? He said yes, and told her what Tom had said. Julie opened her mouth wide in pretend surprise, said Derek had known for ages that they hadn't been good at keeping it a secret. What upset Derek was that they didn't let him in on it. He felt left out when they kept telling him it was a dog. She moved closer, wrapping her arms around her body, and said, Derek wanted to be one of the family, big smart daddy, and he was getting on her nerves. He touched her arm the way she had touched him. Since Derek knew, he said, they might as well tell him. He felt a bit daft going on about that dog. Julie shook her head and locked her fingers into his, saying, Derek wanted to take charge of everything. He kept talking about moving in with them. She squared her shoulders and puffed out her chest, mimicking Derek's line about what the four of them needed, taken care of. He took Julie's other hand, and they moved, so their knees touched. From the cot against the bed, Tom murmured in his sleep and swallowed loudly. Julie whispered now. Derek lived with his mom in this tiny house. She had been there. The mother called him Doodle and made him wash his hands before tea. Julie pulled her hands free and placed them on each side of his face, glancing down between his legs as she added that the mother told her she irons 15 shirts a week for him. He said that was a lot. Julie squashed his face so his lips pushed out like a bird's beak, saying he used to look like this all the time, and now he looked like that, relaxing her hold. He wanted them to keep talking. He said she hadn't done any running for a long time. Julie stretched a leg and laid it across his knee. They both looked at it as if it were a pet. He held her foot in both hands. She said perhaps she'd do some in the winter. He asked if she was going back to school next week. She shook her head and asked if he was. He said no. They hugged. Their arms and legs tangled, so they fell sideways onto the bed. They lay with arms around each other's necks, faces close together. For a long time, they talked about themselves. Julie said it was funny. She had lost all sense of time. It felt like it had always been like this. She couldn't really remember how it used to be when Mom was alive, and couldn't really imagine anything changing. Everything seemed still and fixed, which made her feel not frightened of anything. He said, except for the times he went down into the cellar, he felt like he was asleep. Whole weeks went by without him noticing. If someone asked what happened 3 days ago, he wouldn't be able to tell them. They talked about the demolition at the end of their street and what it would be like if they knocked down their house. He said someone would come poking around, and all they would find would be a few broken bricks in the long grass. Julie closed her eyes and crossed her leg over his thigh. Part of his arm pressed against her breast. Beneath it, he felt the thud of her heart. She murmured that it wouldn't matter, would it, and began edging up the bed until her large, pale breasts were level with his face. He touched a nipple with his fingertip, hard and wrinkled like a peach stone. Julie took it between her fingers and kneaded it, then pushed it toward his lips, whispering for him to go on. He felt weightless, tumbling through space with no sense of up or down. As he closed his lips around Julie's nipple, a soft shudder ran through her body. A voice from across the room said mournfully that now he'd seen it all. He tried to pull away, but Julie tightened her hold, her body screening him from Derek. Supporting herself on one elbow, she twisted around to look at Derek and asked mildly if he had, oh dear. But her heart, inches from his face, was pounding. Derek spoke again, much closer, asking how long this had been going on. He was glad he couldn't see Derek. Julie said, ages and ages and ages. Derek made a little gasping sound. Surprise or anger? He imagined Derek standing still and upright with hands in pockets. Derek's voice was thick and uneven as he said that all those times she never even let him come near her. He cleared his throat noisily, then asked why she hadn't told him. He felt Julie shrug. She said, actually, it was none of his business. Derek said if she had told him, he would have cleared off, left her to it. Julie called that typical. Now Derek was angry, his voice retreating across the room as he said loudly that it was sick. He's your brother. Julie firmly told Derek to talk quietly, or he'd wake Tom up. Derek repeated sick, and the bedroom door slammed shut. Julie sprang off the bed, locked the door, and leaned against it. They listened for Derek's car starting, but apart from Tom's breathing, everything was very quiet. Julie smiled at him. She went to the window and parted the curtains slightly. Derek had been in the room such a short time that now it seemed as if they had imagined him. Julie said he was probably downstairs, moaning at Sue. They were quiet for a minute or two, waiting for the echoes of Derek's voice to die away. Then Julie laid her palm on his belly, commenting on how white he was against her hand. He took her hand and measured it against his, exactly the same size. They sat up and compared the lines on their palms. These were entirely different. They began a long investigation of each other's bodies. Lying on their backs side by side, they compared feet, her toes longer and more slender. They measured arms, legs, necks, and tongues, but none looked so alike as their belly buttons. The same fine slit in the whorl squashed to one side, the same pattern of creases in the hollow. It went on until he had his fingers in Julie's mouth counting her teeth, and they began to laugh at what they were doing. He rolled onto his back. Julie, still laughing, sat astride him, took hold of him, and pulled him into her. It was done very quickly. They were suddenly quiet and unable to look at each other. Julie held her breath. There was something soft in his way. As he grew larger inside her, it parted, and he was deep within. She gave out a little sigh, knelt forward, and kissed him lightly on the lips. She lifted herself slightly and sank down. A cool thrill unfurled from his belly. He sighed too. Finally, they looked at each other. Julie smiled and said it was easy. He sat up a little and pressed his face into her breasts. She took a nipple between her fingers again and found his mouth. As he sucked, and that same shudder ran through his sister's body, he heard and felt a deep, regular pulse, a great, dull, slow thudding that seemed to rise through the house and shake it. He fell back. Julie crouched forward. They moved slowly in time to the sound until it seemed to be moving them, pushing them along. At one point he glanced sideways and saw Tom's face through the cot bars. He thought Tom was watching, but when he looked again, Tom's eyes were closed. He closed his open. A little later, Julie decided it was time to turn over. It was not easy. His leg became trapped under hers. The bed covers got in the way. They tried to roll one way and almost fell off the bed, had to roll back. He pinned Julie's hair against the pillow with his elbow. She said, "Ouch," very loudly. They began to giggle and forgot what they were about. Soon they found themselves lying side by side, listening to the great rhythmic thuds that now proceeded a little slower than before. Then they heard Sue calling Julie's name and pulling at the door. When Julie let her in, Sue threw her arms around Julie's neck and hugged her. Julie led Sue to the bed, where she sat between them, trembling and pressing her thin lips together. He held Sue's hand. Sue said at last that Derek was smashing it up. He had found the sledgehammer and was smashing it up. They listened. The thuds were not so loud now, with pauses sometimes between blows. Julie got up, locked the door, and stood by it. For a while, they heard nothing. Then footsteps down the front path. Julie went to the window and said Derek was getting into the car. Another long pause. Then the engine started, and the car pulled away. The sharp sound of tires on the road was like a shout. Julie pulled the curtains closed, came and sat beside Sue, and took her other hand. They sat like this, 3 in a row on the bed's edge. For a long time no one spoke. Then they seemed to wake up and began talking in whispers about their mother. They talked about her illness, what it was like when they carried her down the stairs, when Tom tried to get in bed with her. He reminded them of the day of the pillow fight when they were left in the house together. Sue and Julie had completely forgotten it. They remembered a holiday in the country before Tom was born, and discussed what their mother would have thought of Derek. They agreed she would have sent him packing. They were not sad. They were excited and awed. They kept breaking out of their whispers until one of them called, "Shh!" They talked about the birthday party at their mother's bedside and Julie's handstand. They made her do it again. She kicked some clothes out of her way and threw herself upside down in the air. Her dark brown limbs barely quivered. When she came down, Sue and he clapped quietly. It was the sound of 2 or 3 cars pulling up outside, the slam of doors, and hurried footsteps coming up their front path that woke Tom. Through a chink in the curtain, a revolving blue light made a spinning pattern on the wall. Tom sat up and stared at it, blinking. They crowded around the cot. Julie bent down and kissed him, saying, "Wasn't that a lovely sleep?" The end. Thank you for spending this time inside the strange and unsettling world of the Cement Garden. Stories like this rarely leave us when the final page is turned. They linger in quiet moments, resurfacing not because of what happened, but because of what they reveal about loneliness, family, innocence, and the fragile structures that hold ordinary life together. Ian McEwan wrote the novel at the beginning of his career, during a period when he was fascinated by the hidden tensions beneath everyday existence. Influenced by psychological fiction, Gothic literature, and the unsettling possibility of what happens when social boundaries disappear, he created a story that feels less like a conventional horror tale and more like a disturbing thought experiment. Much of its power comes from what remains unsaid. McEwan often trusted silence as much as dialogue, allowing discomfort and ambiguity to do the work that explanations never could. That approach was not always easy. As a young writer, McEwan was determined to challenge expectations, exploring subjects many readers found shocking. The risk paid off. The Cement Garden became one of the defining works of his early career and helped establish the voice that would later produce novels such as Atonement, Enduring Love, Amsterdam, and On Chesil Beach. Looking back, it is remarkable how modern the story still feels. Beneath its disturbing surface lies a timeless question. When the rules that shape our lives disappear, what remains of who we are? The house itself becomes a symbol of isolation, grief, secrecy, and emotional decay. A place where childhood and adulthood blur together until neither feels recognizable. More than a decade after the novel's publication, filmmaker Andrew Birkin brought the story to the screen in 1993. Birkin, known for his screenwriting work on The Name of the Rose and his long association with Stanley Kubrick during the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey, approached the adaptation with unusual restraint. Rather than sensationalizing the novel's controversial elements, he focused on atmosphere, emotional unease, and the gradual collapse of normality. Charlotte Gainsbourg's performance as Julie became one of the film's most celebrated achievements. Alongside Andrew Robertson, Alice Coulthard, and Ned Birkin, she helped create characters who felt vulnerable, isolated, and painfully human. Cinematographer Stephen Blackman gave the film its muted, dreamlike visual language, while composer Edward Shermer's score quietly deepened the sense of unease without overwhelming it. What makes the adaptation particularly fascinating is how faithful it remains to McEwan's original vision. Much of the plot, dialogue, and unsettling emotional trajectory survived the transition to film. Yet cinema demanded different choices. Certain internal thoughts that shaped the novel had to be expressed visually, and some scenes were softened or condensed to preserve the film's pacing and emotional balance. The result feels less like a reinterpretation and more like a careful translation from one medium into another. The production itself faced a unique challenge, capturing the story's disturbing atmosphere without turning it into exploitation. Andrew Birkin frequently spoke about preserving the humanity of the characters, and that delicate balance became one of the film's greatest strengths. In a curious behind-the-scenes connection, Charlotte Gainsbourg's mother, Jane Birkin, had worked with Andrew Birkin before, creating an unexpected link between the cast and the filmmaker long before cameras rolled. Over the years, both the novel and the film have inspired debate, analysis, and sharply divided reactions. Some readers see a story about grief and survival. Others see a dark examination of repression and isolation. Many find themselves unsettled by how difficult it is to separate sympathy from discomfort. Perhaps that is why the story endures. It refuses to offer easy answers. If this retelling sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to experience McEwan's original novel for yourself. There are layers of atmosphere, ambiguity, and psychological detail that only the book can fully provide. And if this journey stayed with you, I'd love to hear what you took away from it. Whether you found the story haunting, tragic, thought-provoking, or deeply unsettling, your interpretation is part of what keeps literature alive. Feel free to share your thoughts, your questions, or even your disagreements. If you'd like to continue exploring remarkable stories together, subscribing is a simple way to support more cinematic retellings like this one. And if someone you know appreciates stories that linger long after they end, consider sharing this journey with them. For now, the house grows quiet again. The doors close. The voices fade into memory. But somewhere in the imagination, where stories continue long after their final words, the cement is still drying, the silence is still waiting, and the questions Ian McEwan asked nearly half a century ago remain unanswered. Perhaps that is where the most powerful stories truly live. Until next time.